Harry Potter has been analyzed to death. Like every frame, every wand movement, every slightly suspicious goat reference has a 40-minute video essay already. So you might be asking yourself, what could possibly be new in a video about a freckly redhead who says, "Bloody hell," and eats sandwiches? Why are we still talking about Ron Weasley? And why did you click on this instead of rewatching Prisoner of Azkaban for the 50th time? If you're like me, you grew up with this stuff baked into your brain. Midnight book releases, staying up way too late under the covers, watching the DVDs until the menus burned into your TV, quoting Wingardium Leviosa at people who did not ask for that energy. And in that version of your childhood, Ron is probably just the goofy sidekick, the comic relief, the guy who screams at spiders and exists so Harry and Hermione have someone to roll their eyes at. That's the movie Ron. And I mean, come on, he's fun, but he's also kind of a lie. Because the Ron in the books, he's darker, sharper, and way more dangerous than the films ever let on. He's the 11-year-old who literally wins a life-size death chess match by sacrificing himself. He's the kid who grew up poor in a prejudiced, war-traumatized family, who uses jokes like armor and still ends up being the first one to stand up to Snape when he calls Hermione a slur. He is strategic, insecure, sometimes petty, sometimes cruel, and quietly one of the main reasons Harry lives long enough to be the chosen one at all. If you only watch the movies, you don't actually know Ron Weasley. You know a flattened, safer, more relatable version that the adaptation carved out of him, like shaving off all the sharp edges until he fits into the funny best friend template. You don't have to take my word for it. Once you start lining up book scenes with what the films did, it gets kind of brutal. Why do so many of Ron's smartest, bravest moments vanish on screen? Why does Hermione suddenly know all the niche Wizarding World stuff that, in the books, only a kid raised in that world would realistically know? Why is his entire Quidditch arc turned into one long joke about luck potion instead of a story about anxiety and actually getting good under pressure? At a certain point, you start asking, was this just adaptation necessity, or did the movies quietly assassinate his character to streamline the trio dynamic? Over the next few hours, we're going to peel that apart, iceberg style. We'll start with the obvious differences, then sink down into the really uncomfortable layers, the class insecurity, the jealousy, the Horcrux, the ways Ron fails Harry, and why those failures matter. By the end of this video, you're either going to be ready to defend Ron Weasley with your life, or you're going to realize you've been underestimating him for years. Either way, you're not walking out with the same Ron you came in with. So what are we actually doing for the next 2 hours of your life besides yelling about ginger slander? This is built like a character iceberg, but it's a Ron-only iceberg, which is already kind of cursed. We're going to start at the surface with the easy stuff, the movie misconceptions, the "haha, he's the dumb hungry friend" thing, the way half his best lines got Frankensteined onto Hermione. Then, layer by layer, we move down into the weird, the uncomfortable, and the "wait, that was in the books?" territory. By the time we hit the bottom, we're talking Horcrux hallucinations, class anxiety, and the fact that this supposedly ordinary boy keeps making choices that literally save the plot. You might be asking yourself, why does that need 120 minutes, and why did I click on it in the first place? Because the goal here isn't just to list trivia, it's to completely rewrite the Ron that lives in your head. I want you to walk away with a new mental model of him. Not just comic relief, but a kid who's funny because he's smart, mean because he's hurting, and heroic in a way that looks smaller than Harry's, but is actually way more attainable, And, honestly, way more terrifying. And you don't have to take my word for it. We're going to be in the text, constantly. I'm talking specific book quotes, side by side with the movie scenes that flattened or deleted them. We'll look at his chess game in Philosopher's Stone as a legit tactical performance, not just LOL he sacrifices himself, and then compare that to how the film quietly shrinks his role. We'll pull out the moments where he, not Hermione, explains basic wizarding stuff to Harry, and ask why the adaptations kept deciding he didn't need to know anything. Tone-wise, this is still going to be a conversation, not a dissertation. If you're like me, you process emotional damage with jokes. So yes, we're going to make fun of 12-year-olds getting handed lethal chess pieces and a rat that is, in case you've forgotten, a middle-aged man sleeping in a child's bed for years. It's going to be a little dark, a little unhinged, but every joke is stapled to obsessive research and close reading. I mean, come on, nobody accidentally spends this much time cataloging Ron's throwaway lines. We're also zooming out. This isn't just a "Ron is underrated, respect my son" rant. We're going to talk about fandom discourse, the way early internet culture turned him into the designated idiot, and how the movies leaned into that. We'll dig into class, family, and prejudice, what it means to grow up poor but pureblood, to resent fame and still crave it, to be both victim and carrier of wizarding world bias. And if this kind of long-form character autopsy is your thing, mentally treat this as episode 1. Because if people actually make it through this iceberg, I have a list of other erased book characters waiting in the wings, and some of them get done even dirtier than Ron. Next, we're starting at the top layer, the version of Ron you think you know from the movies, and why that guy barely exists on the page. So, before we dive headfirst into Ron's psyche like it's the Black Lake in November, we should talk about how this whole iceberg thing actually works. And look, if you've made it to 2026 without encountering an iceberg meme, I don't know where you've been, but I'm also kind of impressed. You might be asking yourself, do I need a degree in internet to follow this? No. I'm going to walk you through it without gatekeeping. Picture Ron Weasley as a giant floating triangle of trauma and ginger hair. The bit you see above the water? That's the surface level. That's movie Ron, the goofy best friend, the one-liner machine, the guy who exists to say, "Blimey Harry," and get hit by a stray spell. It's also the most common fandom takes. Ron's just comic relief. He doesn't deserve Hermione. He's the weak link of the trio. That's the stuff everybody knows, or at least thinks they do. Then we start moving down. Each deeper layer is where the water gets colder and the takes get sharper. We're going to hit book-only details, weird bits of characterization the film's quietly erased, and some uncomfortable truths about Ron that even the books kind of whisper about and then look away from. I mean, come on. This is the boy who abandons Harry in Deathly Hallows and also throws himself on a life-size chessboard at 11. Those two people are the same kid. The movies just skim the surface. Structurally, each level of this iceberg has multiple entries, like little frozen pockets of, wait, what? So at the top, you'll see things like Ron the Strategist, where we talk about the chess game and how that wasn't a fluke, or Ron the Emotional Core, where he's grounding Harry and translating Hermione into human. Then, as we sink, we get into Ron and class anxiety, Ron the secret world-building expert, Ron's darkest moment, and stuff the fandom fights about at 3 in the morning. Every entry gets quotes, context, and me pausing to point at the page like, "You don't have to take my word for it. Rowling literally wrote this. The promise is escalation." The further down we go, the more that wholesome red-headed best friend image falls apart. Not in a Ron is secretly the villain way, but in a this is a messy, jealous, brave, petty, traumatized teenager way. By the bottom, he's not a sidekick. He's a fully realized, sometimes unlikable, deeply human character who makes Harry's story possible and also occasionally wants to throw it all away. So before we start, do a quick gut check. If you're like me, you probably came in with a mental version of Ron. Is that surface-level movie Ron? Mid-tier? I read the books once? Ron? Or deep cut? I can quote the locket scene from memory. Ron? Mentally pick your layer and see if you can survive the descent without changing your mind about him. Spoiler: the deepest parts of this iceberg are not friendly waters. Next up, we're starting right at the tip, the glossy, flattened movie Ron, and how that version quietly replaced the real one in most people's heads. So let's talk about the Ron you probably have in your head right now. The movie Ron. The one made of 70% freckles, 20% sandwiches, and 10% screaming at spiders. If you're like me and you grew up on those DVDs, that's the Ron you think you know. He's the comic relief, the jump scare reaction guy, the perpetually hungry best friend who whines, panics, gets jealous, and every so often sort of trips and falls into bravery. He's basically the audience insert for, wow, this is terrifying. Can we not? In case you've forgotten, the films spend a lot of time cementing that version. You get the life-size chess scene in Philosopher's Stone, where Ron's big heroic move is literally sacrificing himself like a pawn on a board, groaning dramatically on the floor while Harry and Hermione gasp over his broken body. You get the bloody hell catchphrase on repeat, to the point where it's almost his entire personality. You get the flying car panic, the slug-vomiting slapstick, the shrieking in the Forbidden Forest when Aragog's kids want a Ron-flavored snack. And visually, the camera is in on the joke. Watch how often the films cut to Ron's horrified face as the punchline. Harry looks determined. Hermione looks analytical. Ron looks like he just remembered he left the oven on, and the oven is full of acromantulas. He trips. He fumbles his wand. He stands slightly behind the other two, shoulders hunched, mouth open. When something goes wrong, the reaction shot is Ron gaping like a goldfish who's seen some stuff. You might be asking yourself, okay, but isn't that just his role? Every trio needs the funny one, right? And yeah, the movies absolutely position him as the least competent of the three. Hermione explains the plan, Harry charges in, Ron complains and messes up the spell. Half the time, if someone has to be the butt of the joke so the scene doesn't get too dark, it's Ron. Broken wand backfires? Ron. Love potion disaster? Ron. Awkward dance, bad dress robes, jealous boyfriend meltdown? Ron. 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 Here's the thing though, that version is still lovable. I don't know where you've been if you can't admit movie Ron is charming in his own chaotic way. He's funny, he feels human, and for a lot of people he's the reason those darker scenes stay watchable at age 11. You don't have to take my word for it. Go back and notice how often his jokes are the pressure valve in a really grim moment. But we're going to ask a slightly uncomfortable question now. Does this surface-level, flailing, bloody hell machine actually sound like the kid Dumbledore keeps trusting with Harry's life? The same headmaster who plays five-dimensional chess with everyone else is supposedly looking at this wobbling bundle of nerves and saying, yes, that one. Put him on the front line. Either Dumbledore's lost it, or the real Ron is hiding under the ice, and the movies barely let you see him. So what exactly did they flatten or erase? And why does it change everything about how brave Ron actually is? So let's talk about the weirdest thing in this whole franchise. The most important, ordinary person in the story is the one the movies treat like background noise with a punchline budget. Ron is not the chosen one. He's not the genius girl who reads 12 books before breakfast. He is, very intentionally, the kid you would probably be if you got dropped into Hogwarts. He grew up hearing about this stuff, sure, but he's still the one going, "Wait, the stairs move? The trees assault people? The spiders talk?" He reacts like a normal person, which is exactly why you and I can use him as a bridge into how this world actually feels from the inside instead of from prophecy height. And that ordinary angle matters way more than his jokes. Harry's life is a horror movie wrapped in a sports anime. Dead parents, abusive relatives, prophecy, random possession. If you're like me, you might be asking yourself, what actually keeps this kid from just snapping and launching Dementor-themed fanfic about everyone? A huge chunk of the answer is Ron. Ron gives Harry a ready-made family to be awkwardly adopted into, complete with hand-knit jumpers, hand-me-down everything, and a mum who will literally scream at you and then feed you. That's not just cozy set dressing. That is emotional life support. Ron also drags Harry into normal teenage problems, crush drama, Quidditch nerves, being jealous because your friend is suddenly wizard famous and you're still poor and freckly, and sharing dress robes with your ancestors. It's messy and petty and sometimes ugly, and it keeps Harry from becoming this saintly trauma robot. You don't have to take my word for it. In case you've forgotten, the books lean hard into how much Harry wants Ron's life as much as Ron wants Harry's. That tension only works because Ron is grounded enough to have a life to be jealous of. He's also the trio's translator. Hermione speaks fluent rulebook and existential panic. Harry speaks punch first, think during. Ron is the one who turns Hermione's, statistically speaking, into, "Okay, so we go to the Shrieking Shack now," and turns Harry's, "Let's break into the Ministry," into something that might actually not get them instantly killed. The chess game in Philosopher's Stone is the loud example, but it's the same pattern later. He's constantly spotting practical details, social dynamics, and pure, "That's a terrible idea, mate." Energy. And that loops back into the big theme the series keeps whispering at you while you're distracted by glowing wands. Heroism is not a personality type. It's a choice scared people make on bad days. Ron is scared all the time. He's insecure, jealous, occasionally cruel. He bails. He comes back. He chooses again. That's the point. I mean, come on. If the only heroes who count are boy messiahs and time-turner prodigies, what are the rest of us supposed to do? Which is why flattening Ron into comic relief in the films quietly drains this theme of its power. If the ordinary wizard stops looking complicated and important, the story tilts back toward destiny and genius running the show. And we're going to keep poking at that, because once you see how many of Ron's serious moments got reassigned, you start realizing the movies didn't just nerf a character. They rewired what the story says about who gets to be brave. And the wild part is, the books don't waste any time proving that point. Ron shows up in year 1 already doing the ordinary wizard, extraordinary choices thing, while the movies are like, cool, what if he mostly screams and falls over? In case you've forgotten, his very first big moment isn't a joke. It's a war game. The life-size wizard chessboard in Philosopher's Stone is literally a battlefield, and Ron is the only one who actually knows how to fight on it. He doesn't just hop on a horse and vibe. He surveys the pieces, figures out where they are, where they've moved, what the enchantments are doing, and then calmly tells Harry and Hermione exactly what to do. He becomes the field commander. We're going to play our way across. he says, like this is just another Christmas at the Burrow, not a death trap made by a sports-obsessed psychopath. He positions them, calls the moves, reads the board several steps ahead, and then he makes the choice the movies kind of rush past. He deliberately sacrifices himself. He sees the checkmate, realizes he has to let himself be taken, and still goes through with it so Harry can reach the stone. On screen, that scene is all spectacle. Big stone knight, dramatic fall, Hermione screaming, you know the drill. But in the book, the tension is in Ron's brain. It's about his knowledge of wizard chess, this very specific, very culturally wizard thing that Harry and Hermione can't fake. You might be asking yourself, isn't that just a kid's game? But that's the point. The joke hobby kid turns out to have the exact strategic skill set needed when the stakes jump to prevent magical fascist from resurrecting. And this isn't a one-off. If you're like me, you remember that before the chessboard, Ron has already picked a side. He meets Harry on the train, shares his food, even though he's poor, explains the entire wizarding world without being weird about Harry's fame, and immediately decides, yeah, I'm with this lonely celebrity disaster forever. No promise of glory, no guarantee Harry isn't secretly awful, just instant loyalty. The fear is there too, right from the start, but it's coded as comedy. Ron's spider phobia gets played for laughs so often that it's easy to forget how intense it is. In Chamber, he's shaking. His voice goes high. His wand barely works. He goes into the murder forest full of giant spiders anyway. I mean, come on, that's not cowardly sidekick. That's deeply traumatized kid still walking into his worst nightmare because his friend needs him. So if the books introduce Ron as a loyal friend, a natural strategist, and someone who acts in spite of fear, why do the movies slowly sand that down into the guy who panics, eats, and complains? You don't have to take my word for it, but once we hit the later films, you're going to see a pattern so blatant it's almost impressive in a messed up way. So let's just kick the table over for a second. What if Ron is actually the brains of the trio, and the movies trained you not to notice? You might be asking yourself, okay, did you hit your head on a bludger? Because the default script in your brain is Hermione Sakuru smart, Harry, Shuck chosen, Ron, snacks and screaming. But that only works if you treat intelligence as test scores and library time. The second you start counting tactical instincts, social awareness, and I actually grew up in this culture and know how it works knowledge, suddenly Ron's looking a lot less like the dumb friend and a lot more like the guy quietly keeping everyone alive. Take Chamber of Secrets. In case you've forgotten, when Harry finds that weird trophy with Tom Marvolo Riddle on it, Ron is the one who goes, wait, that name is familiar, and connects him to the award for special services to the school. That's not random trivia. That's pattern recognition plus cultural memory. He knows the gossip, the history, the way Hogwarts whispers about scandal. In the films, that kind of thing keeps getting shuffled over to Hermione, like the script is physically allergic to letting Ron be the one who puts two and two together. And it's not just that moment. Book Ron is constantly decoding wizarding stuff Harry and Hermione literally have no framework for. He explains why everyone freaks out about you-know-who, what pureblood families are like, how Quidditch works, why certain curses are taboo. He's the guy who grew up in this world. But on screen, that deep, specific knowledge gets flattened into, ha 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 ha, he doesn't know how to say Wingardium Leviosa. I mean, come on. If you're like me, once you start tracking it, it gets kind of creepy. The films reassign his deductions, his jokes that show he's actually listening, even his emotional read on people. Movie Hermione tells Harry about how Cho is emotional. Book Ron is the one who bluntly, accurately, and a little cruelly breaks down Cho's conflicting feelings. That's not him being stupid. That's him reading a person and calling it, even if he shouldn't. And remember the chess game in Philosopher's Stone. Everyone remembers the giant pieces. Fewer people clock what it actually means. 11-year-old Ron is literally commanding a battlefield, predicting moves, sacrificing himself at exactly the right moment. That's not book smarts. That's wargame intelligence. Later, in the Horcrux hunt, he's the one who figures out how to imitate Parseltongue well enough to open the chamber. Under pressure, while half traumatized. That's quick, adaptive thinking. So we're going to run the rest of this iceberg with a different question. Not, is Ron as smart as Hermione? Because that's like asking if a broom is as good as an owl. But what is Ron uniquely good at that the movies erased? Once you flip that switch, a lot of lazy sidekick moments start looking more like deliberate surgery on his competence. And if that sounds dramatic, you don't have to take my word for it. Because next, we're going to look at specific scenes where the adaptation literally lifts Ron's brainwork out of his mouth and hands it to someone else. So let's talk about who they had to turn Ron into for that surgery to work. Because the personality rewrite is kind of wild once you line it up. If you're like me, you grew up with Movie Ron as the default in your head, and then you reread the books and went, wait, who is this loud, chaotic, actually kind of emotionally intelligent goblin, and why did the films nerf him? Book Ron is big energy. He's loud. He's funny in that mean older brother way. He's deeply insecure, and he has the emotional regulation skills of a lit firework. He sulks. He snaps. He says the wrong thing constantly. But sitting under all that is someone fiercely protective and, crucially, surprisingly perceptive about what people are really feeling. This is the kid who clocks Malfoy's motives in about 2 seconds, who understands class and blood prejudice because he lives it, and who uses jokes as both a shield and a scalpel. You might be asking yourself, okay, but isn't Movie Ron also funny and insecure? Kind of, but watch what gets stripped out. Film Ron keeps the slapstick and the screaming and loses the perceptiveness. He becomes the guy who falls off the bed, makes the scared face, delivers the bloody hell reaction shot, and then stands there while someone else explains the emotional stakes. The sharp, cutting humor that reveals he's actually reading the room? Mostly gone. The anger that comes from knowing exactly where he ranks in every room he walks into? Sanded down into generic whining. In case you've forgotten, Book 5 gives us one of the clearest examples. After Harry blows up at everyone in Grimmauld Place, Ron doesn't just go, "Whoa, mate, calm down." He literally gets why Harry is furious before Harry finishes ranting. He points out that Dumbledore has been keeping him in the dark, that everyone's been treating him like a kid, and he does it without making it about himself. That's emotional insight. Same thing with Hermione. Again and again, Ron notices she's upset or jealous before Harry does, and he's the one who explains it to Harry like, "She's mad because you're breaking the rules with that broom, obviously." You don't have to take my word for it. Go back to Prisoner of Azkaban. Ron is the first one to snap at Snape for insulting Hermione's teeth, flat out risking detention for her. That's not just comic relief. That's protective instinct, plus a very fast read on when an adult has crossed a line. The movies compress or erase these little flashes of emotional maturity, and that has a domino effect. When Ron explodes with jealousy in Goblet of Fire or walks out during the Horcrux hunt, Book Ron's outbursts feel like the boiling point of years of insecurity he's been quietly articulating in jokes and asides. Movie Ron, who mostly mugs and panics, suddenly turning cruel. It plays more like random plot spice than a tragic, predictable crack in the trio. And I mean, come on. Once you realize that, the next question is obvious. What happens when you take a character who's emotionally sharp and secretly competent and start handing his actual wins to other people? Next, we're going to dig into the concrete scenes where that happens, starting with Ron's hidden competence that the film's quietly stuffed in someone else's pocket. So let's start with the thing the movies actually did show you, and then quietly refused to learn anything from. Ron's chess game in Philosopher's Stone isn't just, ha-ha, the funny one knows chess. It's the blueprint for his whole role in the books. He's literally reading a battlefield. He sees the whole board, predicts what the enemy's going to do, and then calmly says, "Yeah, I'll get smashed by a stone horse so you two can move on." That's not bumbling. That's a tactician who understands sacrifice. And in case you've forgotten, he doesn't just charge in. He spends several moves testing the pieces, working out how they respond, and only then commits the trio. He's thinking in layers. What do we need? What will they do? What am I willing to lose? You might be asking yourself, okay, but is that just a one-off kid genius moment? If you're like me, you probably grew up with the movies and got trained to see it that way, because after that, the films mostly hand the planning brain to Hermione and the chosen one instincts to Harry. The books do not play it like that. Jump to Deathly Hallows and the Ministry break-in. On screen, it's this kind of chaotic heist where everyone's just sprinting and hoping. On the page, when it all starts going sideways, Ron is the one who keeps patching the plan in real time. He improvises the Reg Cattermole cover. He remembers tiny Ministry details Harry wouldn't know. He adjusts their stories every time someone new asks questions. He's juggling lies under pressure while also worrying about his fake wife being interrogated. I mean, come on, that's spy movie stuff. He does the same thing in the DA. The films give you a fun montage of Harry teaching spells in the Room of Requirement, but you don't see Ron chiming in with, "Okay, but how do we practice this without blowing someone's hand off?" He helps translate Harry's flashy Patronus talk into drills that actual scared teenagers can do. He's the one cracking jokes when people's spells misfire, keeping morale from cratering. You don't have to take my word for it. The narration keeps noting how people relax around him, how the group feeds off that normal kid energy. Compare that to movie Ron, who mostly reacts. Plans happen to him. In the books, he's constantly suggesting routes, backup options, Quidditch strategies, DA tweaks. When you strip that away, his later leadership in the Battle of Hogwarts, or even him calmly directing people during the Horcrux hunt, feels like a personality transplant instead of the payoff to a long, messy learning curve. And that's the real problem. If the strategist side isn't there, his bravery looks like random bursts instead of a pattern. So what else did the films quietly reassign from Ron's character sheet? And who got those stolen moments? And speaking of stolen moments, we need to talk about the single biggest robbery in the adaptations, Ron's competence. Because if you're like me, and your brain still autoplays the movie version, you probably remember Ron's Quidditch career as a long anxiety meme with a couple of slapstick saves. On the page, it's way sharper than that. Ron as keeper is a full anxiety arc. He's terrified. He's practicing obsessively. He's overthinking every move, and then he only relaxes when he thinks Harry's slipped him Felix Felicis. The joke is that it's a placebo. He plays like a brick wall, not because magic juiced his reflexes, but because for once he believes he's allowed to be good. The books frame that whole season as him wrestling his brain into submission and earning his spot, not tripping into it on a lucky day. The films flatten this into Nervous boy accidentally wins. The crowd chants, "Weasley is our king," and it's played like a gag. The Felix twist gets sanded down, and you lose the very specific feeling that this is a kid clawing his way out of an inferiority complex in front of the entire school. I mean, come on. That's the most Ron thing ever. Success as a hard-won ceasefire with his own self-loathing. And it's not just sports. In case you've forgotten, the Department of Mysteries fight is basically Ron's worst nightmares speedrun. Brain tentacles, Death Eaters, his friends getting picked off. He gets hit by that brains in a tank spell, is literally being strangled and half mind melted, and still manages to fire off jinxes, distract enemies, and keep moving with the group until they drag him out. The movie gives him a couple of spells, a fall, and then cuts away. You'd barely know he was injured, let alone that he walks out of that room with magical brain trauma and still shows up for the next war. Meanwhile, in the DA, he's not just the guy making faces in the background. He's consistently there, learning, failing, improving. He backs Harry's leadership when the rest of the school is whispering that Harry's unhinged, and he's one of the people who makes the DA feel like an actual cross-section of Hogwarts, not just a hero fan club. You might be asking yourself, okay, but is that really competence or just attendance? Watch who's still standing in the Battle of Hogwarts. Ron's throwing curses, coordinating with Neville, blowing up the damn bridge. That's not an accident. Here's the pattern interrupt. Incompetent Ron is actually a way more boring character. A Ron who's secretly capable but sabotaged by fear? That guy can grow. That guy can fail horribly, walk out on his friends, come back, and you still buy it. You don't have to take my word for it. The books literally build 6 years of groundwork. When the adaptation erases that and leans on him as the designated clown, you lose the tension between ordinary and essential that makes him interesting. Which raises a bigger question we're going to dig into next. Why would you deliberately sand down the messy, competent, insecure Ron in the first place? And who benefits from that version? Let's talk about the nice answer first, before we start sharpening our pitchforks. If you're like me, you might be asking yourself, okay, is this just what happens when you cram 7 chunky books into 8 movies? And yeah, the practical adaptation argument is real. You've got limited runtime, 1 million plot threads, 10,000 side characters, and a studio going, can we not spend 5 minutes on wizard chess psychology? So the easiest move is to streamline. Instead of 3 mouths explaining things, you collapse character functions. One person is the brave one is the smart one is comic relief, and you just keep feeding them lines that match the label, and you don't have to take my word for it. The scripts literally do this. In case you've forgotten, in Philosopher's Stone, it's Ron who calmly explains wizard chess and then proves he's a strategist by sacrificing himself. In the movie, that's still there, but a bunch of his earlier, I know how the wizarding world works stuff quietly migrates. Hermione gets lines about spells and history that in the books, Ron tosses off like it's basic common sense. Same deal in Prisoner of Azkaban. Ron is the first to snap at Snape for insulting Hermione, but the films keep undercutting that pattern by giving Harry and Hermione more of the righteous speeches. The most obvious example is Goblet of Fire. Book Ron is the one who knows all the Quidditch teams, the World Cup gossip, the weird wizarding celebrities. Movie Ron, mostly there to say bloody hell while Hermione explains the politics. I mean, come on, this is the kid raised in the culture. He should be the one going, Harry, that's the Chudley Cannons, keep up. Instead, the films lean into Hermione as the hyper-competent problem solver for basically everything. And look, I get why. You might be asking yourself, isn't making Hermione the unstoppable genius a win? On one level, yes. A nerdy girl who's always right, saves the boys, and punches Draco. Great. But when every piece of competence has to be routed through her, you accidentally flatten Ron from knowledgeable wizard kid with street smarts, prejudices, and instincts into the guy who doesn't read. It turns intelligence into this one narrow thing: book answers and perfect moral clarity. Emotional intelligence, cultural knowledge, tactical thinking. Those get downgraded. So was that intentional? Did someone sit down and say, we're going to nerf Ron so the trio dynamic is easier for casual viewers? Or is this just unconscious bias toward a certain kind of smart character that tests well? I don't know where you've been, but once you start lining up the changes, the pattern stops feeling like random streamlining and starts to look like something sharper. Because as we go deeper, you're going to see how these little swaps don't just change scenes. They reshape how fans talk about Ron, how they judge him, and who they think actually deserves to stand next to Harry. So if the movies quietly rewired how you judge Ron, you might be asking yourself, what did they leave out about where he actually comes from? Because to get real Ron, we're going to have to walk straight into the Burrow and actually look around instead of treating it like a cozy Pinterest board with chickens. On paper, the Weasley house is warm. It's loud. It's loving. It's literally held together by magic and probably duct tape. But it's also cramped and broke. Ron's got hand-me-down everything. Robes that are too short. Shoes that pinch. A second-hand wand that backfires so hard it nearly kills him. His dress robes for the Yule Ball? Described like a dead great-aunt's curtains. I mean, come on, you can feel the polyester through the page. Now, being poor anywhere is rough. Being poor in a culture obsessed with blood purity, old family names, and who sits where at the Quidditch World Cup. That's its own special horror show. Ron grows up as Weasley, blood traitor, poor. Malfoy literally weaponizes it from day one, sneering about their house, their clothes, their dad's job. In case you've forgotten, Draco doesn't just call him poor, he calls Arthur a muggle-loving fool. Like loving muggles is some kind of contagious disease. You stack that on top of 6 siblings, all of them talented at something, and suddenly Ron's whole personality starts to look less like randomly insecure sidekick, and more like kid who has never once been the best at anything he cares about. Bill is cool and cursed. Charlie wrangles dragons. Percy's head boy. Fred and George are legends. Ginny's a prodigy. Ron gets the hand-me-down rat. So when does that boil over? The books actually show you. At the Yule Ball, he's humiliated by his robes, by not having a date he actually wants, by Victor Crumb casually waltzing in with Hermione. His jealousy comes out as cruelty. He accuses Hermione of fraternizing with the enemy, not because he believes it, but because it hurts less than saying, I feel like the backup option in my own life. Same thing with Malfoy's taunts. Ron is always the first to lunge, wand out, ready to throw hands over a comment about his family. It's not just temper, it's panic. Every insult hits the raw nerve he carries around from the Burrow to Hogwarts, that he's cheap, replaceable, and slightly embarrassing. If you're like me, once you see that, the bad Ron moments stop reading as random nastiness and start looking like really maladaptive coping mechanisms. The sulking, the jokes that go too far, the blow-up in Goblet of Fire when Harry's name comes out of the goblet, even the Horcrux-fueled paranoia later on. All of that is soaked in years of being poor, overshadowed, and hyper-aware of status in a world that ranks people by blood, gold, and glory. And here's the twist the movies barely touch. That same background makes Ron both more prejudiced and more empathetic than you probably remember. He parrots some pure-blood nonsense early on, but he's also the one sitting at the table with muggle-borns, house elves, and half-giants like it's normal. Next level down the iceberg, we're going to dig into that contradiction and see just how dark and how quietly heroic that mix actually gets. And that contradiction gets way sharper when you add one more ingredient: being poor. Not like, oh no, my broom is last year's model poor. I mean chronic, hand-me-downs, counting every sickle poor in a world where your best friend literally sleeps on a dragon-guarded pile of gold. If you're like me, you might be asking yourself, does that actually matter in a universe with magic food and self-washing dishes? It matters constantly. Look at how obsessed Ron is with money-adjacent stuff. His jaw basically hits the floor the first time he sees Harry's vault. He's not just impressed, he's in awe in case you've forgotten, and that awe never really goes away. When the Triwizard Tournament prize money comes up, he reacts hard, because for him, that isn't abstract. That's, my parents never have to argue over cauldrons again money. The firebolt? The movies make it a cool broom. The books make it a symbol of everything he can't have, sitting in his best friend's hands. So what do you do when the world keeps reminding you you're the poor one? You get funny very fast. Ron treats jokes like armor. He roasts his own dress robes before anyone else can, turning that frilly nightmare into a bit so Malfoy can't turn it into a weapon. He jokes about always being hungry, about the state of his wand, about the Burrow literally trying to fall over, because if he can make you laugh, you're not staring at the patch on his elbow. It's strategic. You don't have to take my word for it. Go back and notice how often the punchline is covering something that would be humiliating if he said it straight. Now layer on the Weasley sibling Olympics. Every brother is a success story. Bill the Cursebreaker, Charlie with dragons, Percy the rule-obsessed golden boy, the twins running a joke empire. Ron is stuck in their old robes, using their old wands, walking into classrooms where professors already know a better version of him. I mean, come on, how are you not going to develop an inferiority complex from that? His need to stand out with Harry and Hermione isn't just ego, it's survival. If he's not the funny one, the loyal one, the chess genius, then who is he besides the extra Weasley? The films sand a lot of that down. Movie Burrow is cozy chaos, all knitting and floating pans, like a Pinterest board with chickens. The books let you feel the anxiety, the worry about school supplies, the embarrassment on the platform, the way Ron flinches around rich kids. The class tension is sharper, and so is his shame. And here's where it really matters. Once you see that, some of his worst moments stop being random jerk behavior and start looking like pressure finally cracking the surface. That locket that whispers all his fears? That Yule Ball blow-up? We're going to hit those, and the point where the jealousy stops being funny and starts getting scary. Next. And speaking of when the jealousy stops being funny, we kind of have to talk about the other elephant in the room. Or, in Ron's case, the half-giant, the house elf, and the word mudblood he grew up hearing people fight about. Ron is born into a so-called blood traitor family. The Weasleys are literally on Voldemort's hate list for being too pro-Muggle, too friendly with Muggle-borns, too willing to marry whoever they want. You might be asking yourself, okay, so he's one of the good guys. What's the problem? The problem is that being on the right side politically doesn't magically delete every casual prejudice you absorbed at age 7. In case you've forgotten, Book Ron flinches at a lot of stuff early on. He's clearly uncomfortable around Hagrid's giant relatives. He treats house elves like walking kettles, and he honestly cannot understand why Hermione starts SPIW. He doesn't hate them. He just thinks the system is fine, which is kind of the point. That's how real bias usually works. Not mustache-twirling evil, just, this is how it's always been. What's your problem? We see it in the language he uses. He throws around mudblood as a quoted term before Hermione gets attacked with it, like a swear word he knows is bad, but also sort of normal. He repeats stereotypes about giants being thick and dangerous, buys into the idea that house elves like being enslaved, and he's genuinely shocked when Dobby wants wages. I mean, come on. That's not Voldemort-level bigotry, but it's also not the pure cinnamon roll version the movies try to sell you. And the books don't just let him sit there. Hermione pushes back constantly. Hagrid snaps when Ron parrots daily prophet garbage about giants, and the war itself starts breaking his assumptions. He sees Lupin, the dangerous werewolf, risk everything for them. He watches house elves fight and die in the Battle of Hogwarts. By Deathly Hallows, he's the one worrying about the Muggle-born kids getting hunted, not just Harry's scar hurting. If you're like me, you probably grew up around people who would have absolutely voted against Voldemort, but still made harmless jokes about certain groups. That's Ron. He's got one foot in old pure-blood culture, family history, traditions, all the unspoken rules, and one foot in this messy coalition of Muggle-borns, half-giants, werewolves, goblins, and whoever else Voldemort wants dead. That proximity makes him feel uncomfortably real. Pattern interrupt for a second. Compare that to movie Ron. On screen, he's either comic relief or generic loyal friend. The awkward learning curve, the moments where Hermione is furious at him for not getting it, the scenes where Hagrid's hurt by his assumptions, those pretty much vanish. You don't see the slow, embarrassing process of unlearning. And you don't have to take my word for it. By the end, Book Ron is the one volunteering to save house elves before the final battle. That's not a gag. That's growth. It's also a way darker, more mature arc than people give him credit for, which makes the next stage, when those same instincts curdle into paranoia and cruelty under the locket, hit a lot harder. We're going to dig into that uglier version of Ron next. And here's where it stops being cute, because that uglier version of Ron? It's not some random personality flip. It's sitting on top of years of very specific, very understandable jealousy. If you're like me, you grew up kind of thinking, oh, Ron's just jealous of Harry because Harry's the main character. Easy, right? But you might be asking yourself, what happens if you put that on top of a kid who has literally never been the best at anything in his own house? Bill, head boy, cursebreaker, cool ponytail. Charlie, dragon wrangler, Quidditch legend. Percy, prefect, head boy, ministry golden boy. Fred and George, comic geniuses, business moguls in training. And then Ginny shows up and casually becomes a star chaser and Harry's love interest. Ron is the sixth son, the spare redhead in a lineup of overachievers. Add poverty into that stew. The Burrow is loving, but everything Ron owns is second-hand, patched, or broken. His wand, his robes, even his pet. He's not just one of many. He's the one who feels like the family's hand-me-down. So when Harry walks in on the Hogwarts Express with a trunk full of brand new stuff and a vault of gold he didn't even know he had, that hits every nerve Ron already has about being poor, ordinary, and forgettable. And the cruel joke is, he loves Harry. He genuinely thinks Harry is brilliant and brave and funny. He's the one explaining Quidditch, wizard chess, all the cultural stuff. He's proud to be Harry's friend. But that pride sits right next to, why him and not me? You don't have to take my word for it. Look at Goblet of Fire. When Harry's name comes out of the goblet, Ron doesn't just think, "You lied." He thinks, "You didn't even need this. You already have everything." That explosion is about every Christmas where Harry gets the spotlight of being the boy who lived, while Ron is just there. Same thing with Hermione. The movies flatten this into a kind of sitcom bickering, but Book Ron is also jealous of her. She's Muggle-born, walks into his world, and immediately outperforms him at school, becomes a prefect, gets invited to Slughorn's parties, and, in case you've forgotten, goes to the Yule Ball with Victor International Quidditch star Crumb. Ron's not only threatened by Harry, he's surrounded by people who keep proving he's the least impressive person in every room. By the time we get to Deathly Hallows, the locket doesn't invent new insecurities. It just rips the scab off all of this. The fight in the tent, the accusation that Harry and Hermione don't need him, that horrible vision of them kissing, those are long simmering fears with dark magic poured over them like gasoline. And I mean, come on, that's already bleak. But the locket is going to push him even further than the movies let you see. We're going to crack open that scene next, and it's not going to be pretty. Level 4 is where the Iceberg stops being fun character trivia and starts feeling like group therapy you did not consent to. Because to get to the real Ron, we have to sit with his worst stuff, not just the memes and the "not now, Mum, I'm on the night bus" energy. I mean the ugly moments, the abandonment, the cruel, cutting things he says when he's hurt, the times he flat out chooses cowardice over courage. If you're like me, you probably grew up thinking of Ron as the loyal one. But that loyalty only means anything because he breaks it. Walking out on Harry and Hermione in Deathly Hallows isn't a quirky little plot beat. It's him failing the one thing he's supposed to be good at. You might be asking yourself, doesn't that just make him a bad friend? And the uncomfortable answer is, for a while, yeah, it kind of does. But that's the point. His heroism isn't this steady, unbroken line of bravery. It's jagged. It's him being petty, jealous, saying horrible stuff about Harry's fame or Hermione's choices, and then having to look that version of himself in the eye later and decide whether he's going to stay that guy. The locket is where all of that gets weaponized. This isn't just a cursed necklace that makes you a bit grumpy. It goes straight for Ron's specific pressure points. Growing up poor, always second best, always the sidekick. It whispers that he's least loved, that his mother wanted a daughter, that Harry will take Hermione and the spotlight and leave him with nothing. In case you've forgotten, this is a kid who spent his whole life in hand-me-downs watching his best friend literally get showered with gold and glory. And the books really sit in that spiral. We stay in Ron's paranoia, his fixation on the Deluminator not being enough, his resentment about the radio and the food, and Harry not having a plan. The fight in the tent is long, messy, repetitive, in that very real way arguments get when you're actually trying to hurt someone. The movie keeps the broad strokes, but it sands off the internal monologue, the way he's half aware he's being unfair, and does it anyway. You don't have to take my word for it. Compare the book's vision from the locket to the film. On the page, it's this drawn-out psychological striptease of every insecurity he has about poverty, insignificance, and losing Hermione. On screen, it's creepy, sure, but faster, cleaner, less like watching a nervous breakdown, and more like a spooky boss fight. We're going to lean into the breakdown version. From here on, the tone gets darker, because Level 4 is about Ron at his absolute worst, so that his later choices actually mean something. Next, we're cracking open that locket scene in detail and asking a very simple, very nasty question. When Ron swings the sword, who is he really trying to kill? If you're like me, when you think Ron at his worst, your brain jumps straight to the locket scene. But the dress rehearsal for that meltdown? It's the Yule Ball. It's glittery, it's festive, and emotionally, it's a drive-by shooting. In case you've forgotten, Ron spends weeks not asking Hermione, kind of assuming she'll just be free, like a library book he can check out last minute. Then she shows up with Victor Crumb, international Quidditch star, and Ron reacts with the emotional maturity of a dropped flobberworm. He doesn't say, "I'm hurt, I wanted to go with you." He basically accuses her of fraternizing with the enemy, and fraternizing is me being polite. Jealousy, possessiveness, and total cluelessness all crash into each other, and the result is him yelling that she's messing him around when she literally did the bare minimum of having her own life. You might be asking yourself, is that just teen drama, or is Ron actually cruel here? And the answer is, yes, both. The books linger on it. Hermione's crying, furious, doing the whole, "Next time, ask me before someone else does" speech that the movie keeps, but in print, it's way rawer. Ron stews, sulks, throws digs at Crumb for chapters. It's not a one-scene spat. It's a slow burn of insecurity and entitlement. Cut to Lavender. Ron's been sidelined, humiliated at Quidditch practice, convinced Hermione doesn't like him that way, and his self-worth is somewhere under the Whomping Willow. So when Lavender Brown starts literally worshipping him, he latches on like a drowning man grabbing the nearest inflatable, except the inflatable is another human being with feelings. This is not a love story. This is an overcorrection. Their relationship in the books is intentionally unbearable. The 1-1 baby talk, the public makeouts, the Christmas necklace that probably smells like cheap perfume and desperation. He's not with Lavender because he's wildly into her. He's with Lavender because she makes him feel visible after years of being Harry's friend and one of the Weasleys. And he absolutely uses her to make Hermione jealous. That's not subtext, that's text. And he's genuinely hurtful. He dismisses Hermione's pain, pretends not to understand why she's upset, keeps snogging Lavender in front of her, and only really breaks it off when it stops feeding his ego. You don't have to take my word for it. The book drags this out over months, while the film plays it as a quick gag montage with some awkward couch-sitting. That's the big difference. On screen, the Yule Ball fight and the Lavender arc are sped-run for laughs. In the books, it's awkward, petty, repetitive, and honestly kind of exhausting, which is exactly how real teenage mess feels when you're inside it. And this is where it matters for the Iceberg. Because once you've seen Ron at his pettiest, using people, saying the exact thing that will hurt most, the Horcrux doesn't invent those dark thoughts out of nowhere. It weaponizes stuff that's already been festering. We're going to take that festering and crack it open next, because when the locket speaks in Ron's voice, it's not just evil magic talking. It's every Yule Ball, every Lavender kiss, every not good enough feeling turned up to 11. So let's actually open that locket, because this is where Ron's brain gets turned inside out on camera. And on the page, it's even worse. In case you've forgotten, the Horcrux doesn't just go boo and show him spiders. It goes straight for the jugular. His place in the trio, his place in his family, his place in the entire story you've been reading. When Harry opens it and tells Ron to stab it, the book has this voice pour out of the locket that sounds like Ron, but cruel, saying he's the least loved of all your mother's children, that she'd rather have the boy who lived as a son. I mean, come on, that's not a random insult. That's every Christmas jumper and every second-hand book turned into a weapon. Then it escalates. The locket hisses that Hermione would choose Harry, that she would be better off with him, that Ron is nothing, nothing, nothing compared to the chosen one. It drags in the poverty, too, mocking the hand-me-down robes and books. Basically, every Weasley insecurity that's been simmering since Platform 9 3/4. You might be asking yourself, is the Horcrux just being dramatic? No. It's quoting Ron's private drafts of his own autobiography. Second best, The Ron Weasley Story. The movie does capture one slice of this really well and really weirdly. When the locket opens, you get that smoky nightmare of Harry and Hermione making out, half naked, talking about how they never really needed Ron. It leans hard into the romantic jealousy, which, if you're like me, made you deeply uncomfortable watching that in a crowded theater with popcorn in your lap. But the film kind of underplays the class shame and the family stuff. We don't hear that line about his mother preferring Harry. We don't get the full, you were born in the wrong family, into the wrong body, into the wrong role monologue. On the page, it's not just, your crush doesn't like you back. It's, you are surplus to requirements in your own life. That's the psychological core of Ron's whole arc. He's not just afraid of losing Hermione. He's afraid of being the extra Weasley, the extra friend, the extra wizard in a world that only has room for legends and prodigies. And then he kills it anyway. That's the part you don't have to take my word for. He is shaking. He is crying. He is literally listening to his worst thoughts narrated back at him, and he still swings the sword. Courage here isn't some Gryffindor poster slogan. It's choosing to act while your brain is actively trying to convince you that you don't matter enough to bother. So is this Ron's bravest moment in the entire series, more than any physical battle or joke or sacrifice we've seen so far? I'm going to leave that hanging for a second, because we're going to circle back to that question once we've seen what he does after the locket is gone, and who he becomes when the voice in his head finally shuts up. And who he becomes when the voice in his head finally shuts up. Because in case you've forgotten, the next big thing Ron does is walk out. He literally abandons Harry and Hermione in the middle of the Horcrux hunt. Not metaphorically, not took a break from the group chat. He disapparates into the night with the only person who knows how to destroy Horcruxes screaming after him. You might be asking yourself, how do you square that with Ron's secretly a hero? Isn't that just straight-up betrayal? And, I mean, kind of, yeah. On paper, it's a catastrophic decision. They're in the middle of nowhere, being hunted by the entire fascist government, with a cursed necklace that's basically an anxiety podcast from Satan, and Ron is the one with the most practical survival skills. Leaving is not a gray area. It's objectively awful, but the book spends a lot of time making you sit in the stew that leads up to it. We're going to rewind the tape a bit. Months of camping. Cold, damp, nothing to eat except sad mushrooms and whatever Hermione can conjure that tastes like depression. Harry's scar is going off. The radio is listing new dead people every night, and Ron's entire family is on that list of potential corpses. Meanwhile, he's wearing the Horcrux for long stretches, and that thing is whispering every insecurity he's ever had straight into his bloodstream. If you're like me, you read those chapters, and you can feel how sidelined he is. Harry and Hermione are planning, reading, sharing this intense mission brain. Ron is the ordinary one, stuck between the chosen one and the girl who can recite 12 books from memory. The locket just keeps poking that bruise. You're extra. You're poor. Your mum prefers Harry. Hermione prefers Harry. You're dead weight. I don't know where you've been, but if you've ever been the third wheel in your own friend group, that stuff hits. So when he finally explodes, it's not a random tantrum. It's panic plus resentment plus sheer exhaustion. He's terrified the Burrow has already been raided, that his dad is dead at work, that Ginny is being tortured for fun. He's watching Harry wander around with zero plan, and he can't handle being the support character on an impossible quest where the main guy keeps saying, "I have no idea what we're doing." And the narrative does not pat him on the head for that. Harry is livid. Hermione is shattered. The separation in the book is long and ugly. Ron spends weeks stewing in guilt, trying to get back, nearly dying to return. The movie trims it down, sands off the worst of the silence and self-loathing, and turns it into more of a "we had a fight, then we made up" arc. But Ron's later heroism only lands because this moment is such a complete failure. You don't get a real redemption beat without something genuinely worth redeeming, and walking out on the Horcrux hunt is about as bad as it gets without joining the Death Eaters. Which raises the question, what kind of story decides to give its comic relief character that level of moral faceplant, and then hands him the Sword of Gryffindor? And that's exactly why the way he comes back matters. The story doesn't just yeet Ron into a pit of failure and leave him there. It quietly sets up one of the most grown-up choices in the whole series, and the movies kind of sprint past it like it's a gag. In case you've forgotten, the mechanism for that choice is the Deluminator. On the surface, it's a cute little light sucker. But for Ron, it's basically a portable intervention from Dumbledore. This is the same kid who has spent 6 books convinced he's the least special Weasley, the sidekick to the chosen one, the one nobody would ever pick first. And then he finds out Dumbledore, of all people, left him a bespoke magical device that only works because Dumbledore assumed Ron would leave, and also assumed Ron would want to come back. That's brutal and kind at the same time. Dumbledore has more faith in Ron's better nature than Ron does. You might be asking yourself, isn't the Deluminator just a plot device to get Ron back to the tent? The book really doesn't treat it that way. When Ron explains that he heard Hermione's voice, that he clicked the Deluminator and the light went inside him, it's not just, "Oh, cool, teleportation." It's a metaphor for finally listening to the part of himself that isn't jealousy and self-loathing. For once, he doesn't follow the voice that says, "Harry likes Hermione more," or "Your mum wanted Harry to be her son." He literally follows Hermione's voice calling his name. That's him choosing connection over insecurity. And coming back is not safe. It's not triumphant. It's humiliating. Ron has to apparate into a freezing forest, almost drown, get strangled by Horcrux jewelry, and then stand there dripping wet, while Harry, who he abandoned, decides whether to hex him into next week. He knows Hermione is going to be furious. He knows he deserves it. He does it anyway. If you're like me, you've definitely delayed apologizing to someone over like a mildly rude text. Ron walks back into a war camp where he is objectively the bad guy in the room. The book slows down and lets you sit in that. You get his panic when he realizes what he's done, the weeks of trying to get back, the shame when he admits he wanted to return the second he disapparated. The film? It turns the reunion into banter. Harry's like, "Where have you been?" Ron cracks a joke. They wrestle. It's all very, "the lads are back." It's charming, but it dodges how ugly that guilt actually is. And that's why this is one of Ron's most mature decisions. Not that he never fails, but that when he fails in the worst possible way, he chooses to come back, own it, and do better. You don't have to take my word for it. The very next thing the narrative hands him is the Horcrux vision, which is basically his psyche saying, "Oh, you think you've grown? Prove it." And that "prove it" challenge is where Ron quietly levels up from sidekick to something way harder to replace. He becomes the emotional core of the trio. Harry might be the plot center, Hermione might be the problem solver, but Ron? Ron is the emotional weather report. You want to know how things are really going? You check Ron's forecast. If you're like me, you probably grew up thinking Harry sets the tone because, title of the series, Chosen One, Trauma Magnet, all that fun stuff. But go back to the books and watch what actually happens in the room. When Ron is relaxed and joking, everyone breathes. When Ron is sulking or furious, the whole trio goes gray. In case you've forgotten, even in Philosopher's Stone, Harry clocks that when Ron laughs at something he says, it feels like social oxygen. When Ron withdraws, Harry panics way more than he does about any random Slytherin glaring at him. And that's where the humor comes in, because Ron's jokes are not just, "Ha ha, redhead go brr." They're survival tools. Look at Prisoner of Azkaban. They're dealing with soul-sucking prison wraiths and a convicted murderer supposedly hunting Harry, and Ron is the one cracking lines about, "If you want to kill Harry, you'll have to kill us too." Is that bravado? Yeah. Is it also the thing that lets Harry keep functioning instead of curling into a ball on the night bus? Also, yes. You might be asking yourself, isn't that just comic relief? But comic relief is throwaway. Ron's humor is pressure relief. In Goblet of Fire, pre-Triwizard, he's making fun of Dudley's diet and Molly's fussing, and you can feel the tension slide off Harry's shoulders. Even in Deathly Hallows, before the locket really gets its claws in, Ron's the one turning camping misery into something they can laugh at. Once that stops, notice how fast everything starts rotting from the inside. He's also the buffer between Harry's chaos and Hermione's rulebook. Harry's default is, act now, think never. Hermione's is, submit 3 forms in triplicate. And Ron is constantly running emotional translation between them. When Hermione is furious about the Half-Blood Prince textbook, Ron's the one going, basically, "Okay, but also the homework does itself. Can we admit that's cool?" When Harry is ready to torch the world because the ministry sucks, Ron grounds it in. "Yeah, but people still have to go to work, mate." And socially, Harry is lost without him. The books have this running gag where Harry keeps glancing at Ron to see if something is normal. Wizard chess, chocolate frog cards, how poor is too poor? What's a pure blood supposed to think about giants? Ron is his cultural Google. You don't have to take my word for it. Look at how many times Harry literally waits to see Ron's reaction before deciding how he feels about some weird wizarding thing, which sets up a problem. What happens when the emotional barometer walks out of the tent? When we get to Deathly Hallows and Ron is gone, Harry and Hermione finally have the duo the movies pretended they always were. And the vibe is ice cold. The jokes dry up, the arguments get sharper, and the whole dynamic turns brittle in a way that is not cute, not romantic, and very much not sustainable. We're going to dig into just how broken that version of the trio really is in the next section. So when Ron walks out of that tent, you don't just lose a body, you lose the atmosphere. The second he disapparates, the air in there goes dead. It's quiet in a way that isn't peaceful. It's that hospital waiting room silence where nobody wants to move too fast in case everything actually shatters. Harry copes by going full mission mode. He clings to the Horcrux hunt like it's a life raft, because if you're like me, you remember he literally cannot handle one more person abandoning him. Hermione does the opposite. She kind of folds inward, buries herself in spell research, and cries when she thinks Harry's asleep. They're both grieving, but instead of talking about it like functional humans, they just stop talking. And that's the wild thing. Their conversations don't become deeper without Ron. They get thinner. It's all logistics. Where do we go next? What did the sword inscription mean? No color commentary. No Ron complaining about the food. No dumb Quidditch gossip to remind you these are still teenagers. You might be asking yourself, isn't that more efficient? And yeah, it is. It's also joyless in a way that makes the whole mission feel like a slow, emotional suffocation. In case you've forgotten, Ron used to be the guy who translated the wizarding world for Harry, and, honestly, for us. Without him, Harry and Hermione are two half-muggle nerds guessing at pure-blood politics. They don't know what a random family name means. They don't have Ron's "my dad works at the ministry" and "my brothers know everyone" context, and the ideas dry up fast. No, let's break into the ministry dressed as employees. No, hey, the Deluminator isn't just a light switch, just wandering in forests and hoping Dumbledore left a walkthrough. On a practical level, it's actually kind of scary. Ron is usually the one who calls Harry out when he starts edging into martyrdom speedrun mode. Remember first-year chess? Third year, yelling at Harry for wanting to sneak into Hogsmeade? Fifth year, backing him up, but still questioning the Department of Mysteries plan. Without that voice, Harry's worst impulses go mostly unchecked. Hermione will argue with him, but she's also emotionally wrecked and laser-focused on rules and research, not on reading Harry's self-destruct meter. So this whole tent section starts to feel like a narrative experiment. What if the movie's fantasy came true, and it really was just Harry and Hermione, the golden duo, carrying the plot? What if you strip out the comic relief and see what's left? You don't have to take my word for it. The book literally shows you. The dynamic gets brittle, the plan stagnates, and the story itself starts looping. Walk, argue, relocate, repeat. I mean, come on, we joke about camping the novel for a reason. And that raises a pretty uncomfortable question. If Ron hadn't come back, with the Deluminator, with the sword, with the one person willing to drag Harry out of a frozen death pond, does this mission actually succeed? Or are we looking at a timeline where every one of Harry's supposed solo victories quietly collapses without the guy the films kept shoving to the edge of the frame? And speaking of timelines quietly collapsing without Ron, we kind of have to talk about the one place the movies almost break reality: his relationship with Hermione. On screen, it looks like classic rom-com logic. They bicker, they glare, they randomly make out in a pile of rubble. Soulmates, right? But if you're like me, you might be asking yourself how we got from "it's Leviosa" to "let's get married and name a kid after a dead teacher." The answer is very slowly and very painfully, and in a way that only works if you're looking at book Ron, not movie comic relief Ron. Their early fighting isn't just ha-ha opposites. It's two insecurities smashing into each other. Ron mocks Hermione's know-it-all tendencies because he's the poor boy with hand-me-downs who feels stupid next to her perfect homework. Hermione judges Ron's laziness and immaturity because she's terrified that if she isn't the best, she's nothing. That's not incompatibility. That's two kids weaponizing their own fears. And then you start getting these tiny transitional moments. In Prisoner of Azkaban, Snape calls Hermione an insufferable know-it-all. Ron, who has literally used that exact phrase, immediately snaps back. "You asked us a question, and she knows the answer. Why ask if you don't want to be told?" He's not just defending her. He's choosing her dignity over his fear of Snape. You don't have to take my word for it. That's the first time one of them publicly takes a hit for the other. Fast forward to the Department of Mysteries. In case you've forgotten, when Hermione is knocked out by that silent purple curse, Ron completely loses it. The jokey, "let's make fun of the brains in jars" guy suddenly sounds horrified at the idea she might be dead. Later, at Malfoy Manor, when Hermione is being tortured upstairs, Ron is screaming himself hoarse, begging Bellatrix to take him instead. I mean, come on, the films give you a taste of that, but the book locks you in a room with his panic. Over 7 books, Ron learns to value Hermione's intellect and her moral convictions even when they annoy him or don't make sense to him. He backs her on house elf rights at the Quidditch World Cup. He trusts her plans in the DA. He follows her lead on things like the Horcrux hunt, even when he's scared and hungry and angry. At the same time, Hermione learns to read Ron under the jokes, the way his jealousy usually hides feeling worthless, the way his teasing is often him trying to connect without sounding vulnerable. Here's the pattern interrupt. If you only watch the films, their eventual kiss kind of feels like the director spun a wheel labeled straight couples. The movies lean on visual hints, awkward hand brushes, jealous glances, a sudden jump to romance in Deathly Hallows. The books, by contrast, are a slow accretion of mutual respect, of "I will stand up to a teacher for you," and "I will throw myself at a Death Eater for you," and "I will come back after abandoning you because I realized you were right." Their relationship only makes sense if Ron is allowed to be as deep, insecure, and brave as he is on the page. Flatten him into the goofy sidekick, and Hermione ends up looking like she downgraded from a tragic hero to the class clown. See the real Ron, and you suddenly get why the smartest witch of her age picked the boy who was always, quietly, choosing her. And once you see that, you start noticing something else the films quietly erased. Ron's actual competence, especially when it comes to strategy and magical history, which is where we're going to go next. And once you realize Ron is low-key, the brains of the operation sometimes, you have to talk about the other half of his job, being Harry's almost brother, almost rival, and accidental mirror. Because this friendship is not simple. It looks cozy on the surface, but underneath it's a constant, messy negotiation of who has what. Harry walks into the Burrow, and suddenly he's drowning in exactly what he's been starved of his whole life. Noise, hand-me-downs, a mum who hugs you so hard you probably see stars. If you're like me, you can feel how much he envies Ron's chaos. Harry would trade all the galleons in his vault and half his scar trauma just to argue over the last sausage with a sibling. Meanwhile, Ron is staring back at Harry going, "Cool, you have a vault, a firebolt, your own fan club, and apparently every adult in this castle wants to adopt you. You might be asking yourself why that doesn't explode sooner, but it does." Their big fights are basically those unspoken resentments, putting on little name tags and walking out into the open. Goblet of Fire first. On paper, Ron is being petty about Harry's name coming out of the goblet. But underneath, it's years of Harry gets picked, Harry gets noticed, Harry gets the nice robes, finally snapping. He doesn't believe Harry because some part of him is tired of being the side character in his own life. And Harry, who has literally never had a friend before age 11, has no idea how to process being doubted by the one person who's supposed to always be on his side. Fast forward to the Horcrux hunt, and the locket is basically a cursed megaphone for all that buried stuff. It throws his poverty in his face, his fear that Harry and Hermione don't need him, his belief that he's the expendable one. When he leaves, it's awful, but it's also honest. The story finally says out loud, this bond is fragile, and it hurts. But here's the thing the movies flatten. Ron keeps choosing Harry anyway. From snapping at Snape for insulting Hermione, to backing Harry over the Ministry in Order of the Phoenix, to walking out of Umbridge's class, he keeps tanking his own social standing to stand next to the kid everyone thinks is either insane or lying. You don't have to take my word for it. In case you've forgotten, he literally burns his chances with Lavender and half of Gryffindor because he sticks with Potter Stinks guy. And when Harry isn't being a political lightning rod, Ron is the one who lets him be a normal, deeply confused teenager. They complain about homework, obsess over Quidditch, catastrophize about asking girls to the Yule Ball. I mean, come on. Nobody else is telling the Chosen One that his crush tactics are tragic. In the end, Ron is the one who silently shows Harry what he's actually fighting for. Not prophecy, not glory, but a future where you survive long enough to have a loud, imperfect, ordinary life. The films keep sidelining Ron's point of view, and you lose that. And once you see that gap, you start noticing all the other places the adaptations quietly sanded off the darker, messier edges of wizarding relationships, which we're going to dig into when we look at how the series treats family, class, and blood status. And once you see those edges getting sanded off, you kind of can't unsee the biggest one. Ron isn't just comic relief, he's a war survivor. Like an actual child soldier. If you're like me, you grew up so used to Harry being the traumatized one that you almost forget Ron is literally right there in the trenches the entire time. You might be asking yourself, okay, but is child soldier a bit dramatic for the funny redhead who eats all the toast? I mean, come on, look at his resume. Starting at 11, he's playing life-size lethal chess where getting knocked off your horse could kill you. Second year, he's wandering around a school with a basilisk in the plumbing while his little sister is being possessed. By fifth year, he's in the Department of Mysteries getting nearly killed by Death Eaters, and from there it just escalates into full guerrilla warfare. In case you've forgotten, Deathly Hallows turns Ron's life into one long panic attack. He's tortured by proxy every time the trio hears Hermione screaming at Malfoy Manor. He listens to Bellatrix threatening to carve her face off while he's locked in a cellar, completely helpless. He spends the entire book convinced that at any second, the Snatchers or the Ministry are going to murder his parents, wipe out Fred and George, kill Ginny at Hogwarts. Harry worries about dying for the cause. Ron worries about everyone he loves dying because of the cause. And that's before you even get to the Horcrux. The locket is basically a portable anxiety disorder that whispers every insecurity he's ever had. Second best son, second best friend. Hermione will choose Harry. Your mum wanted a girl. It shows him visions of Harry and Hermione kissing just to twist the knife. That isn't just jealousy drama. That's psychological warfare on a 17-year-old who already thinks he's disposable. So how does Ron cope with all of that? He jokes. Constantly. He's cracking lines on the way to what might be their deaths in the forest. He's making fun of his own splinched arm. He's the one turning, "we're camping in a magical fascist state," into something barely livable. That's not immaturity. That's triage. He's doing crowd control on everyone's nervous systems, including his own. Harry broods. Hermione overprepares. Ron weaponizes humor, because if he stops talking, he has to actually feel how bad it is. You don't have to take my word for it. Compare them in the tent. Harry spirals inward. Hermione builds routines and plans. Ron cracks jokes until the locket finally overwhelms him, and he snaps. The movies frame that as him being flaky, but if you read it as a burned-out kid soldier having a breakdown after years of white-knuckle coping, his return is less comic sidekick apology tour and more guy who almost didn't make it back from the front line. And after all that, the epilogue just drops him on platform 9 3/4 like, he's fine now, don't worry about it. Is he? We're going to talk about post-war Ron, what recovery could even look like for him, and why the neat little bow the series ties might be hiding something much darker. And part of that darker thing's that Ron doesn't just have trauma in theory. He earned it the old-fashioned way, by getting absolutely wrecked in actual war. Let's start in the Department of Mysteries, because the movie acts like Ron's main contribution is, "Ha ha, wacky spell, he's drunk now." In the book, he's terrified, sure, but he's also actively fighting. He's stunning Death Eaters, throwing impediment jinxes, hauling Harry away from danger. He gets hit by that weird purple curse from Dolohov, still keeps casting, and only stops when the brains attack him. And in case you've forgotten, those aren't just props. They literally wrap around him, burrow into his skin, and start showing him visions while he's screaming. The kid gets psychic brain tentacled and is still trying to help his friends. That's not comic relief. That's body horror. You might be asking yourself, okay, but after that, does he ever stop panicking long enough to be useful? Battle of the Astronomy Tower says hi. While the film mostly parks him in the background, Book Ron is part of the group sprinting into chaos, dueling Death Eaters, trying to protect the castle while everything's falling apart. He's not the chosen one. He's not the genius witch. He's just a 17-year-old with a wand and a lot of adrenaline, and he still runs toward the screaming instead of away from it. Then we hit the Battle of Hogwarts, where the movies really start redistributing his kills like they're doing a Hermione side quest. On the page, Ron is everywhere. He's defending the Room of Requirement. He's helping get people out through the passage to the Hog's Head. He's literally yelling at Percy to move because people are dying. He helps save Fred earlier in the fighting, then keeps going after Fred's death instead of collapsing. If you're like me, you read that as someone who has been in danger so often that he just compartmentalizes and keeps moving, which is not healthy, but very war veteran. Pattern interrupt. The basilisk fangs. The movie treats that like Hermione's big brainwave. In the book, it's Ron who remembers. Mid-chaos. Hey, giant corpse snake in the basement. Free anti-Horcrux kit. He breaks into the chamber speaking Parcel tongue from memory, grabs the fangs, and that directly prevents the entire Horcrux mission from stalling out. That's quick thinking under fire, not guy who forgot the tent pegs again. And he's also the one who insists they help evacuate the younger students, not just chase glory. He's yelling about getting people out, worrying about house elves, trying to pull as many bodies away from the kill zone as possible. You don't have to take my word for it. The narration keeps flagging how scared he is and how he acts anyway. So when the films center Harry and Hermione in every combat shot, you lose that balanced trio dynamic where Ron is a consistently brave, if anxious, fighter. I mean, come on. His war record looks a lot less like cowardly sidekick and a lot more like frontline infantry who survived by sheer stubbornness. And that's exactly the guy we're going to follow into the so-called peacetime epilogue, where all that battlefield wiring doesn't just vanish because he's buying school robes for his kids. And here's the thing nobody in the epilogue font wants to talk about. That frontline infantry kid walks out of Hogwarts carrying a body count and a family-sized crater. Fred dies, and the books just keep moving. The films? They sprint. If you're like me, you blinked the first time and went, wait, that's it? On paper, Ron has the perfect recipe for survivor's guilt. He grows up as the not-quite twin to the resident comedy gods, always the audience, never the double act. Fred and George are the brilliant ones, the inventors, the guys literally leaving Hogwarts early to succeed. Ron is the one who stays, who stumbles, who ends up in the mud and the Horcrux tent. And in the end, who's still breathing? The brother who always felt like the understudy. You might be asking yourself how that doesn't wreck him. The text doesn't give you a big cathartic monologue, but it does something weirder. It parks Ron next to everyone else's grief. He's at his mum's side. He's around George. He's in the middle of the Weasley huddle. He comforts Hermione. He sticks close to Harry. He's physically present in all the morning scenes. What he almost never gets is a moment where someone turns and says, "Ron, how are you?" The camera in your head just keeps swinging past him to the chosen one and the bereaved twin. So his processing leaks out sideways. Watch what he does, not what he says. When Fred's mentioned, Ron will crack a joke that doesn't quite land, or he'll suddenly pivot to practical stuff. Where they're staying, what job they're going to get, whether George will keep the shop. In case you've forgotten, this is the same guy who used humor as armor from Book 1, but post-war it stops being charming and starts feeling like triage. Those quick subject changes. That's a kid who knows if he looks directly at the hole in the family, he might fall in. Even before the battle, you get little rehearsals for that silence. After he comes back from abandoning Harry and Hermione, he wants forgiveness, but can barely say the word. The locket literally drags his worst thoughts into the open, and once it's destroyed, he doesn't unpack them. He just gets on with the mission. That's the Ron pattern. Catastrophic feelings, tiny acknowledgments, immediate forward motion. Compare that to the movies, where post-battle emotions are basically, "Well, that was wild anyway," cut to 19 years later. We lose the awkward jokes, the half-finished sentences, the hanging questions around Fred. Film Ron gets a single devastated reaction shot. Book Ron has to live in that castle for hours, maybe days, with his brother's body in the next room. So what kind of adult do you get when you mix battlefield instincts, chronic self-doubt, and a grief he never really names? I don't know where you've been, but we're going to have to talk about the Ron who walks into that epilogue. And the version of him the books quietly hint might exist after the cameras fade. Post-war, Ron actually tries on the proper hero costume first. He and Harry both go into the Auror office, and for a little while, you've got this image of them as magical cops cleaning up Voldemort's leftovers, kicking in doors, arresting ex-Death Eaters, doing all the gritty, noble, paperwork-filled stuff the epilogue absolutely does not have time to show you. And then Ron quits. He walks away from the badge and joins George at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, the same joke shop he once treated like Disneyland with price tags. You might be asking yourself, wait, the guy who helped save the world trades hunting dark wizards for selling puking pastilles to teenagers. That's the point. That whiplash is the story. If you're like me, you read that career move as 3 things at once. First, it's a Fred thing. The shop is the twins' shared dream, and Fred dies in a literal explosion of dark magic and bad politics. Ron stepping in isn't just helping George with inventory. It's grabbing hold of that last living piece of Fred's personality and refusing to let it collapse under grief. It's survivor's guilt, but weaponized into retail. Second, humor as healing. Ron has always used jokes like armor. In case you've forgotten, this is the kid who cracks up about slugs while he's literally vomiting them, who makes fun of his own second-hand robes before anyone else can. After the war, staying in the Auror office would mean reliving the trauma on loop. The joke shop lets him turn fear into fireworks, anxiety into skiving snack boxes. It's not avoiding the past, it's alchemy. Dark memories go in, ridiculous products come out. Third, and this is big, it's him stepping sideways out of Harry's shadow. As an Auror, he's always going to be Harry Potter's partner, the +1 to the chosen one. At Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, he's a co-owner, a Weasley, a brother, a businessman who actually knows the culture he's selling to. You don't have to take my word for it. Canon literally has him become this confident, joke-slinging adult who can walk into a room without immediately being the other one. A lot of fans call this wasting his potential, like the only valid use of bravery is a pensioned government job with a wand holster. I mean, come on. After a childhood of spiders, chess sacrifices, brain-melting horcruxes, and watching his brother die, choosing joy work is its own kind of heroism. Someone has to rebuild a world where kids' biggest problem is buying a nosebleed nougat, not dodging unforgivables. Ron's arc is quietly radical. He fights a war so he can earn an ordinary happy life, and then he actually takes it. Not as a consolation prize, but as the goal. And once you see that, the boring epilogue version of him starts looking a lot more like the bravest choice he ever makes. Which raises one last question about how the films handle that ending that we're going to get into next. And once you see that, you can't unsee what the films quietly did to get us somewhere completely different. Because to land on goofy sidekick who lucks into a normal life, the adaptations had to sand off entire layers of Ron Weasley. We're going to pull those layers out, one by one. Strategic intelligence? Mostly gone. Emotional insight and that weirdly sharp social radar he has in the books? Flattened into jealous outbursts. Class anxiety and poverty shame? Turned into a couple of eat slugs jokes. His prejudice and growth around house elves and blood status. Background noise. And the full brutality of his darkest moments, like the locket fight, trimmed down until he just looks like a moody boyfriend who rage quits the camping trip. You might be asking yourself, okay, but how bad can a few line swaps really be? I mean, come on, let's hit a few of the worst ones. In Philosopher's Stone, it's Ron who solves the chessboard and literally sacrifices himself. The film keeps that. But in later movies, his pattern of tactical thinking just evaporates. In Prisoner of Azkaban, Book Ron is the one who stands up to Sirius first, broken leg and all, yelling that Sirius will have to kill him to get to Harry. The movie hands that to Hermione. Same story in Deathly Hallows. In the book, Ron is the one who remembers basilisk fangs in the Chamber of Secrets. The film gives the epiphany to Hermione like it's her side quest. And then there's the empathy theft. In Half-Blood Prince, Ron is the one who comforts Hermione after Lavender, who notices Harry's feelings for Ginny, who calls out how messed up it is that everyone expects Harry to die. On screen, that emotional framing gets redistributed to Harry himself or to Hermione, while Ron is busy eating sausages in the background. If you're like me and you grew up on both, your brain kind of merges them. But imagine only knowing movie Ron. You see a boy who's cowardly in the Shrieking Shack, useless in planning, randomly cruel to Hermione, and mostly around for slapstick and jealousy. Are you going to walk away thinking, wow, quiet war hero who chooses domestic happiness? Or are you going to think, how did this guy land Hermione again? I don't know where you've been if you missed this, but early fandom spaces were brutal about him. Ron-bashing fanfics, shipping essays that treated him as dead weight, whole threads asking why Harry didn't just ditch him. You don't have to take my word for it. The receipts are still out there. And while some of that is just fandom being fandom, you have to wonder, would that wave have been as big if the films hadn't spent a decade downgrading his competence and stealing his best moments? Pattern interrupt. The story doesn't end with that erasure. Fans get weirdly protective when canon drops the ball. Next, we're going to look at how fan fiction and meta tried to rebuild Ron from the rubble, and what those fixed versions say about the Ron we were supposed to get all along. And part of that rubble? It's not just vibes and justice for Ron mood boards. The movies literally walk into the books, grab his best lines, and hand them to Hermione, while Ron stands in the back like an unpaid extra. In case you've forgotten, let's start with the Snape logic puzzle in Philosopher's Stone. In the book, we get this very un-movie-friendly moment where Hermione is like, "This isn't magic, it's logic." and Ron just lets her cook. But the point is that Ron has already had his big intellectual win, the chess game. He's the strategist who sees the board, sacrifices himself, and literally clears the way for Harry. The film keeps the sacrifice, cuts the explanation, and then quietly removes the logic puzzle entirely. Result? Hermione is the brain, Harry is the hero, and Ron is the guy who gets knocked out like a ginger NPC. You might be asking yourself, okay, but that's just pacing, right? Except this pattern keeps going. Chamber of Secrets in the book. Ron is the one steeped in wizarding lore, tossing out stuff about monsters, school history, and you don't want to get expelled, mate, practicality. Movie version? Hermione suddenly recognizes the basilisk, decodes the pipes, and basically speedruns the mystery solo, while Ron mostly complains about his broken wand. I mean, come on. We took a magical creature that literally lives in plumbing and gave the eureka moment to the Muggle-born who didn't even grow up with talking portraits. Then you hit the emotional theft. In Prisoner of Azkaban and Goblet of Fire on the page, Ron is the one who keeps grounding Harry, fighting with him, forgiving him, and backing him up again. He stands up to Snape for calling Hermione a mudblood-adjacent insult. He's the one sulking and then apologizing at the Yule Ball fallout. He comforts Harry in those weird post-trauma dorm scenes. The films quietly slide a lot of that into Hermione's column. She hugs, she scolds, she pep talks. Ron? Ron's over in the corner eating. And look, I don't think the screenwriters sat down like, how do we assassinate Ronald Bilious Weasley today? If you're like me, you can see the good intention. Give Hermione more to do. Make the girl genius, visibly smart, and emotionally central. That's great. But when you boost her by cannibalizing Ron's competence and empathy, you've turned character growth into a zero-sum game. Someone has to lose for her to win, and it's almost always the poor kid with hand-me-down lines. What that does on screen is brutal. The trio stops feeling like a three-pointed shape and starts looking like a duo plus an add-on pack. Harry and Hermione become the real team, solving, feeling, deciding. While Ron is pretty much optional comic relief you could swap out with Seamus and nobody would notice. You don't have to take my word for it. Ask yourself, if the films had kept Ron's original lines and moments, would all those Harry-Hermione ships, the character rankings, the endless Ron doesn't deserve Hermione discourse, even exist in the same way? Or are we about to find out just how much one adaptation choice can hijack an entire fandom's love life? And fandom said, challenge accepted. If you were around early Harry Potter internet, you probably remember the Wild West era where Ron wasn't just sidelined, he was collateral damage. You'd open a fanfic that's supposedly about friendship and 2 paragraphs in, Ron has been killed off by a random Death Eater so Harry and Hermione can grieve into each other's mouths. Or he's written as this cartoonishly abusive boyfriend, screaming at Hermione so she has a morally clean runway to leap into Harry's arms. Subtlety? I don't know where you've been, but it was not invited. You might be asking yourself, why Ron? Why not just have Harry and Hermione break up with their actual partners like normal messy teens? Because if you're like me, you've seen how fandom loves a clean ship. A lot of early Harmony and Dramione fic treated Ron as the disposable obstacle. Too stupid, too jealous, too Weasley to matter. The movie version made that easy. Take away his competent moments, leave the sulking and the jokes, and suddenly it's realistic that Hermione would grow out of him. Then you had the other side of the battlefield, the Ron Defense Squad. These were the book people, the ones who had his dialogue memorized and could quote chess moves at you. They were writing 10,000-word meta-essays about his inferiority complex, trauma from growing up poor in a war family, and why walking away from the Horcrux locket is actually a breakdown, not a punchline. They built entire fix-it universes where Ron gets his own narrative weight instead of being the designated third wheel. And this is where fandom gets interesting. Because those Ron stans weren't inventing a new character out of nowhere, they were dragging book canon back into the room. Strategic Ron? That's the kid who wins life-size wizard chess at 11, who understands Quidditch tactics, who spots practical dangers Harry and Hermione miss. Caretaker Ron? That's the boy shoving food at Harry, defending Hermione from Snape, babysitting his entire chaotic family. Trauma-aware Ron? That's the teenager whose worst moments line up perfectly with class shame, war anxiety, and a cursed Horcrux whispering his deepest fears. Pattern interrupt. None of that is in the movies in any coherent way. Instead, we get what a lot of book fans started calling canon gaslighting. You read 7 books with one Ron, walk into the theater, and this other guy shows up wearing his sweaters. Same name, different soul. You start doubting your own memory. Was he always this useless? Did I just project the chess thing? Why does Hermione suddenly know every obscure wizard detail Ron originally explained? And you don't have to take my word for it. You can literally see the split in fanworks. On one side, movie Ron as punchline or obstacle. On the other, book Ron as emotional core, strategist, and deeply flawed, deeply loved disaster. The real Ron never went anywhere. He's in the text, and he's been quietly preserved in that corner of fandom that refused to let the adaptation overwrite their guy. The mainstream perception just hasn't caught up yet, which becomes really important once we start talking about how the Horcrux locket scene got reframed on screen. And once you see that, you kind of can't unsee who else got the same treatment. Ron isn't some weird one-off adaptation casualty. He's part of a whole little graveyard of flattened characters, quietly buried under glossy lighting. And John Williams. Take Ginny. Book Ginny is a menace in the best way. She's funny. She's ruthless at Quidditch. She's hexing boys who mess with her friends. She's literally the one who tells Harry to stop brooding and either act or move on. Movie Ginny? She ties his shoelace. She feeds him a mince pie. She stands in doorways like an NPC, waiting for you to press A. You might be asking yourself, did we really go from possessed by Voldemort at 11 and walks it off to girl who zips jackets and just call it a day? And if you're like me, once you notice that, you start side-eyeing everyone. Lupin in the books is this quietly desperate, chronically broke, morally tangled adult who makes awful choices because he's terrified of being a danger to people. On screen, he's like sad professor aesthetic with a cool Patronus. Tonks goes from chaotic, politically radical, constantly changing hair disaster to woman who exists to be sad about Lupin, which is a wild demotion for someone introduced tripping over an umbrella stand and still being Auror-level competent. I mean, come on, even Dumbledore gets hit by this. Book Dumbledore is whimsical, manipulative, occasionally kind of terrifying. He lies, withholds, plays 12-dimensional chess, and then admits he messed up horribly. Movie Dumbledore oscillates between kindly grandpa and did you put your name in the goblet of fire meme generator. The mess is sanded down. The contradictions get filed off. We're going to pretend that's not important to how you read the whole story? What's going on here is a pattern. The films keep taking these messy, inconveniently human characters and compressing them into easy archetypes. The funny best friend, the stoic mentor, the cool teacher, the love interest who stands slightly behind, Harry in group shots. Ron's case just feels louder because he's on screen so much, but he's living in the same neighborhood as Ginny, actually terrifying in the books. Weasley and Remus should probably be in therapy, not teaching children. Lupin. So, at this point, I don't know where you've been if your brain isn't already building a little character iceberg of its own. Top tier. The obvious ones like Ron and Ginny. Mid-tier. Tonks, Dumbledore, maybe even McGonagall. Deep tier. The ones you're going to yell about in the comments with citations and page numbers. You don't have to take my word for it. Half the fun of this stuff is you pulling your copies off the shelf and going, wait, that line was Ron's? But before we spin off into a whole cinematic war crimes series, we need to finish our current descent. Because if you think the adaptation only messed with Ron's jokes and background shots, wait until we hit the Horcrux locket, the way the films reframe his lowest moment, and what that does to the deepest, weirdest parts of his character. Level 8 is where the casual fans get off the ride. This is the floor for people who have, highlighted their paperbacks and can quote Ron's dialogue by chapter and page number. Down here, we're going to talk about the tiny stuff. The throwaway lines, the background lore, the offhand interview comments that never made it into the movies but quietly rewire how you see Ron. You might be asking yourself, how much damage can a middle name or a wand swap really do to my understanding of this freckled disaster? Quite a lot, actually. Let's start with the basics. The films never bother to say out loud, Ronald Bilious Weasley. Bilious isn't just funny. It's the name of his dead uncle who once saw a grim and died 24 hours later. Ron grows up with a literal family cautionary tale about omens and pointless death baked into his identity. In case you've forgotten, this is the same kid who spends multiple books terrified he'll die horribly and meaninglessly. The movies just play that as, haha, he's scared of spiders. But the text is like, no, this is generational anxiety with a punchline stapled on. Then there's his wand situation. In the films, it's basically just a prop that sometimes backfires. In the books, he starts with Charlie's old wand, which is snapped in the Whomping Willow, and only gets his own, proper wand in Prisoner of Azkaban. That means for 2 whole years, the poor kid is literally trying to keep up with the chosen one and the brightest witch of her age, using a broken hand-me-down that doesn't like him. If you're like me, once you notice that, his constant insecurity stops being quirky and starts looking like a pretty reasonable reaction to being underarmed in a war story. Pattern interrupt. Let's talk about Ron's weird little moments of kindness and cruelty that the movies either flatten or delete. He's the one who awkwardly, but sincerely, tries to make Hermione feel better about not getting all the answers right. He sends Ginny a singing get-well card that embarrasses her, but also proves he's paying attention. Then the same boy turns around and mocks Lavender relentlessly after their breakup, or laughs at a canary attack that leaves her sobbing. You don't have to take my word for it. The text swings between softest brother energy and petty teen boy with a mean streak in about 3 pages. Individually, these crumbs feel like trivia. Together, they build a Ron who is superstitious, class-conscious, touch-starved, and constantly trying to prove he's not expendable. I mean, come on. Once you stack the middle name, the dead uncle, the busted wand, the hand-me-down everything, and the way he overreacts to being left out, you're not looking at comic relief anymore. You're looking at a kid who lives in fear of being the extra Weasley who doesn't matter. And we're only just hitting the weird stuff. Next, we're going to dig into the Horcrux locket, the ugliest thoughts it drags out of Ron's head, and how the films quietly sanded off the parts that make him genuinely unsettling. And the locket is where all those little Ron details you've been half ignoring suddenly come home to roost. Because if you're like me, you might be asking yourself, does that horror show vision the Horcrux throws at him come out of nowhere? Or has the text been quietly setting us up for it the whole time? Let's start with one of the tiniest, loudest moments the movie's cut. Snape and Hermione's teeth. In Prisoner of Azkaban, book version, Snape calls Hermione an insufferable know-it-all. Ron actually snaps back, out loud, in front of the whole class, that Snape shouldn't call her that. That's already risky. But in Goblet of Fire, it escalates. Snape mocks Hermione's teeth after she's been hit with a curse that makes them grow uncontrollably, and Ron instantly yells, "She's got them too," pointing at Malfoy's boils so Snape will have to look. He's not thinking about detention, or house points, or, the fact that this is a man who casually threatens to poison students. He just cannot stand someone humiliating her body like that. That's the pattern. Impulse first, survival second. You don't have to take my word for it. The books bury this stuff everywhere. Early on, Ron is the kid constantly shoving food at other people. He shares his sandwiches with Harry on the train without making it weird. He gives Harry chocolate after Dementor attacks. He hands over his Chudley Cannons posters, his jumpers, his whole bedroom, like it's nothing. And when Ginny's possessed in Chamber of Secrets, he's the one barreling into danger alongside Harry, not because he has a plan, but because that's his little sister, and of course he's going. We see it with younger students too. In Order of the Phoenix, when he's a prefect, he's actually decent at it in a very Ron way. He threatens to write up kids for bullying. He backs up Hermione with the first years. He's constantly low-key policing the common room. It's not glamorous. It's just that his default setting is, are you picking on someone smaller than you? Absolutely not. But the deep cuts aren't all flattering. Ron's got casual prejudice baked in, and the text does not let it slide. He makes offhand comments about giants being dangerous before he meets Hagrid's brother. He parrots pure-blood attitudes about Slytherins. He's weird about house elves in Goblet of Fire. The narrative keeps pairing that with Hermione's activism and Hagrid's humanity to quietly say, yeah, this is what growing up in a biased culture looks like, and you actually have to unlearn it. Put all of that together, and you get a kid who feels things at maximum volume and acts before his brain catches up. Sometimes that means stepping in front of Snape's cruelty or defending a scared first year. Sometimes it means blurting out something ugly that he's going to regret 3 books later when a Horcrux weaponizes it. And if those micro-moments can do that, what happens when we dig into the really strange Ron-adjacent lore? The near-death prophecy that might have been about him, the cut plotline where he nearly didn't survive the series. We're going to talk about the versions of Ron that almost existed, and they're way darker than anything you saw on screen. And speaking of darker versions of Ron that almost existed, we have to talk about the joke class that really isn't a joke for him. Divination. In case you've forgotten, Ron walks into Trelawney's tower like he's entering a school play he didn't audition for. He's immediately making up predictions, nudging Harry, doing the whole, "You're going to suffer, but be happy about it" routine. He literally treats crystal balls like improv prompts. And you might be asking yourself, okay, so he's a teenager clowning around in a nonsense class. What's the big deal? The big deal is that Ron's doing 2 things at once. On the surface, it's genuine skepticism. He grew up in a house where real magic fixed real problems. His mom's household spells, his dad's ministry job, his brothers blowing up toilets with fireworks. Compared to that, misty tea leaves and a woman who lives for dramatic gasps are going to look pretty much ridiculous. I mean, come on. If you've watched your dad come home with actual bite marks from a cursed car, I see a tall, dark stranger is not impressing you. But underneath the eye-rolling, it's a defense mechanism. If fate is real, if the future is written in your cup, then Ron has to stare down the possibility that he is permanently the sidekick, the sixth son, the backup friend, the one whose name never makes the prophecy wall. It's a lot safer to laugh at Trelawney's death omens than to ask, what if the stars already decided I never get out from Harry's shadow? You don't have to take my word for it. Watch how fast his jokes ramp up whenever the predictions get close to home. He jokes about Harry dying, about doom, about grim sightings, with this casual, almost bored tone. That's not because he's heartless. That's a kid who's grown up in a world where you-know-who was a bedtime story, and his uncles probably swapped near-death stories over Christmas pudding. If you're like me, you read those scenes and realize Ron has learned to laugh at fear the way other kids learn to ride a bike. Compare that to Hermione. She doesn't joke. She rejects the entire subject on rational grounds. For her, divination is bad data. For Harry, it's the opposite problem. He's uneasily fascinated because prophecy has already wrecked his life once. Ron lives in this third space where it's all a bit of a laugh, right up until it isn't. And this is the pattern. Even in a throwaway classroom scene, Ron's instinct is to turn everything into a bit, to armor plate his terror with punchlines. That habit is going to look a lot less cute when a certain locket starts talking back. So we've got this kid who turns fear into punchlines, which raises the uncomfortable question you might be asking yourself. Is Ron Weasley actually a good person? Or did we all just imprint on the first ginger we saw on the Hogwarts Express? Let's not sugarcoat it. Ron has some pretty awful moral moments. He abandons Harry and Hermione in Deathly Hallows, not in some noble, I must go alone way, but in a sulky, jealousy-fueled storm out while they're literally camping from fascism. In Goblet of Fire, he's cruel to Harry for weeks, convinced Harry lied about the tournament just to steal the spotlight. He throws "Weasley is our king" back at himself as a pity party, snaps at Hermione constantly, and in case you've forgotten, he casually parrots prejudices about house elves, giants, and even Slytherins, because that's just what his world has taught him. A lot of his worst stuff comes from jealousy and cowardice, not wanting to stand out, not wanting to be poor Ron in the shadow of Harry the Chosen One and Hermione the Genius. But if you're like me, you can't stop there, because the same kid who runs away is also the one who keeps walking back into the fire. This is the 11-year-old who calmly sacrifices himself on a life-size chessboard, fully expecting to be knocked out so Harry can go on. This is the boy who breaks his leg in Prisoner of Azkaban rather than let Sirius kill Scabbers. He throws himself in front of Harry during the Shrieking Shack scene. He's ready to die in the Department of Mysteries. He comes back after the locket literally weaponizes his deepest insecurities and shows him his worst fears. And crucially, he apologizes. Not in a neat, tidy way, but in the messy, stumbling way real people do when they know they've screwed up and still have to look their friends in the eye. So what do we do with that? We're going to draw a line between being nice and being good. Ron is frequently not nice. He's moody, tactless, occasionally mean for the laugh. But when the pressure spikes, he usually chooses goodness. He sides with the oppressed. He keeps fighting Voldemort. He goes back to the tent. He walks into the Battle of Hogwarts instead of using his pure blood status and his mum's anxiety as an excuse to stay home. Niceness is how pleasant you are at breakfast. Goodness is who you are when someone might die. Compared to Harry and Hermione, Ron's sins just feel louder. Harry literally uses an unforgivable curse and trashes Dumbledore's office. Hermione mind-wipes her parents, traps Rita Skeeter in a jar, and straight-up jinxes Marietta Edgecombe with permanent facial scars. But because Ron is the comic relief, his flaws get played as punchlines, so you notice them more and forgive them less. I mean, come on. If the movies gave Harry the Locket meltdown and Ron the noble angst, we'd probably be having a totally different conversation right now. You don't have to take my word for it, but I think the discomfort is the point. Sitting with a hero who is sometimes cruel, sometimes petty, and still worth loving is weirdly confronting. It feels like looking at your own worst teenage impulses and asking, did I grow past this, or did I just get better at hiding it? And that's where the locket comes back in, because the story doesn't just punish Ron for his ugliness, it externalizes it, magnifies it, and then asks him to swing a sword straight through it. And when you watch him swing that sword, you suddenly realize, oh, this idiot with crumbs on his jumper has been playing 5-dimensional chess the whole time. Not just on that board in first year, inside his own head. Which, by the way, is a rabbit hole I am absolutely not done with. If you're like me, once you start seeing Ron as a strategist, you can't unsee it. So one thing we're going to do in a future video is go full psychoanalysis but make it chessboard and track every strategic decision Ron makes across the series. I mean every move. From I'll be a knight on the life-size board to don't eat the chocolate cauldrons to hey Harry, maybe don't say Voldemort's name when we're on the run and being magically tracked. That's not just luck. That's pattern recognition from a kid who's been gaming systems his whole life because he never had the advantage. You might be asking yourself, is that overkill? Are we really going to pause on, like, Ron's casual throwaway comments and treat them like Grandmaster openings? Yes, obviously. Because when you line them up, you start to see this really weird consistency. The films flatten him into the guy who falls off his chair, but the books quietly keep handing him the, actually, this is how the wizarding world works lines. You don't have to take my word for it. In case you've forgotten, half the exposition about pureblood politics, Quidditch, and even how the night bus works originally comes out of Ron's mouth. But the other rabbit hole that opened up while I was researching this is Ron and Hermione as a communication disaster simulator. Not in a should they have ended up together way, but in a what does it mean that two traumatized war teens keep trying to solve everything with jealousy and homework way. I want to do a whole breakdown of their relationship just from a conflict resolution angle. When does Ron use humor as a shield? When does Hermione weaponize being right? And how do they slowly, painfully, learn to say the actual thing instead of the safe thing? It's messy. It's cringe. It's kind of beautiful. And then zoom out even further, because Ron doesn't exist in a vacuum. He exists in the Weasley hive mind. I'm toying with a Weasley family dynamics iceberg, where Ron is one chunk of a much larger, slightly terrifying glacier. Top layer is cozy sweaters and dragon-bitten dad, sure. Deeper down, you get hand-me-down shame, Percy's defection, Fred and George turning trauma into comedy, Ginny's possession, Molly's overprotection, Arthur's muggle obsession in a blood purity war. Ron's inferiority complex suddenly looks a lot less random when you park it next to 6 siblings and a chronic money shortage. All of these are my new favorite rabbit holes, but we need to land this one. So before we spin off into 10 different series, I want to pull everything back together and ask, what does the real Ron Weasley actually do to the story of Harry Potter when you put him back in focus? Because once you answer that, a lot of the series starts to look very different. So let's actually stress test this. If you're like me, You've probably been mentally keeping score this whole time, asking, okay, but what is Ron's bravest moment? Is it the chessboard? The locket? Coming back after he bails? Or swinging in at the Battle of Hogwarts like a ginger cavalry charge? In case you've forgotten, 11-year-old Ron literally volunteers to be crushed to death by a stone queen. That's not subtle. That's not, oops, I tripped into heroism. That's a kid who knows the rules of the game, calculates the cost, and says, yeah, I'll eat that. It's raw, physical courage, and it sets the template for who he is way before the movies turn him into the jump scare reaction guy. Then you've got Battle of Hogwarts Ron, running into a war zone where mandrakes are being yeeted off walls and giant spiders are snacking on students. He's defending his home, his family, the girl he loves. It's huge. It's cinematic. It's the stuff trailers are made of. The film's actually like this version of bravery, because you can put a filter on it and add sparks. But you might be asking yourself, what about destroying the locket? Isn't that just stabbing jewelry? I mean, come on. That scene is quietly the nastiest thing the series does to any of the trio. Harry faces Voldemort, external evil, green light, big snake. Hermione faces torture, prejudice, the system. Ron is forced to face himself, his own voice, his own insecurities, weaponized into a hallucination that tells him he's worthless, unwanted, second best, and then literally shows Harry and Hermione making out in spectral HD. Most of us will never duel a Dark Lord, but being trapped in a room alone with every horrible thing your brain says about you at 3 a.m.? That's relatable horror. And Ron doesn't just endure it. He swings the sword through the vision that feels truest to him. He kills the version of himself that believes the locket. That's why I'd argue this is his bravest moment. It's not about external danger. It's about internal demolition. Compare that to Harry's bravest moment in Deathly Hallows, walking into the forest to die. That's martyr courage. Hermione's? Continuing to plan, research, and care even after Ron leaves, when she's heartbroken and freezing and still casting protective charms every night. That's endurance courage. They're all vital, but Ron's is the one where the story says, you are your own worst enemy, and you still have to pick up the sword. And this is where Deathly Hallows quietly belongs to Ron as much as to Harry. The book rips him apart, shows you the ugliest version of him, and then lets him claw his way back into the narrative on purpose. He chooses to return. He chooses to apologize. He chooses to destroy the Horcrux that knows him best. That's character growth, not comic relief. You don't have to take my word for it. Dumbledore literally leaves him the Deluminator because he knows Ron will leave and need a way back. The emotional stakes of that actually sit on Ron's shoulders, not Harry's scar. So if the real Ron is that central and that brave, what happens when you line that up against the movie version and start counting what got quietly stolen from him? What happens is kind of wild. Once you plug the real Ron back into the story, Harry Potter stops being this clean, shiny, chosen one narrative and starts looking like a messy group project where the kid who forgot his lunch money keeps saving everyone's life. Ron is the proof of concept for one of the series' core beliefs. Ordinary, flawed people can be terrifyingly brave at exactly the worst possible moment. He's not a prophecy child. He's not a genius. He's not secretly a prince. He's a nervous, jealous, occasionally petty teenager who still walks into a life-size chess game knowing the move that wins is the move that breaks his ribs. You might be asking yourself, isn't that just standard Gryffindor stuff? But compare him to the background lions who cheer and vanish. Ron's fear is on the page, his insecurity is loud, and he still steps up. That's the point. And because he's broke, he drags class into a story that really wants to be about magic destiny. If you're like me, you probably read the Burrow scenes as cozy wish fulfillment when you were a kid. Hand-knit sweaters, chickens, enchanted dishes. Revisit them as an adult and it's like, oh, this is poverty with good lighting. Second-hand wands, hand-me-down robes, a dad stuck in a dead-end ministry niche. Through Ron, we feel how humiliating it is to wear dress robes that look like a dead great-aunt's curtains, how seductive Malfoy's money and sneering confidence are, how blood traitor is both a slur and a class weapon. Harry's rich and famous. He literally doesn't notice prices. Ron notices every sickle. That's why his growth matters so much. He starts as the kid who wants the spotlight Harry never asked for. By Deathly Hallows, he's the one who chooses to come back after leaving, who destroys the Horcrux that weaponizes all his ugliest thoughts, and who, after a war, decides he actually wants a job at Weasley's Wizard Wheezes and a family. The series moves from chocolate frog cards and flying cars into torture, fascism, and mass death, and then back into this almost aggressively normal domesticity. Ron tracks that curve. He goes from fantasizing about glory to being okay with being the guy behind the counter selling joke wands because his people are alive. You don't have to take my word for it. Look at who he keeps alive emotionally. He grounds Harry when Harry wants to play martyr. He translates Hermione's theory brain into practical, how do we not die today plans, and he carries all the ugly questions about whether any of this is worth it. I mean, come on, the kid literally voices the audience's burnout in the tent. Are we actually getting anywhere, or are we just collecting trauma like chocolate frog cards? Once you take that seriously, the series stops being about one special boy and turns into a story about a community barely holding together under the weight of someone else's prophecy. Heroism has a cost. Broken families, scars, people who never get statues because they were just sidekicks. Ron is that cost, walking around making bad jokes so Harry can keep doing capital P plot. So here's where we're going to zoom out. If the real Ron is this different once you look closely, what does that say about everyone else you thought you knew? In case you've forgotten, the movies quietly rewired a lot of people. I want you to start mentally pulling on those threads. Your favorite character, your least favorite, the one you barely noticed. Are you actually remembering them, or the streamlined, movie-friendly version? Hold that thought, because we're about to start breaking a few more of those open. So let's actually do it. I want you to pull up the Ron in your head right now, the one you walked into this video with. Goofy best friend, kind of scared, always eating, mostly there to say, "Blimey, Harry," and get dragged along for the plot. Got him? Good. Now slam him next to the version we've been building, the kid who wins a literal war game at 11, grows up in poverty, carries a decade of hand-me-downs and hand-me-downs of trauma, loves hard, messes up harder, and still walks back into the fire. If you're like me, that comparison is a little uncomfortable, because you might be asking yourself, wait, have I been low-key disrespecting Ron Weasley for 15 years? And the answer is, probably, yeah. Not on purpose. The movies trained us. They sanded off the strategic stuff, the ugly jealousy, the religious devotion to Harry, and left you with a joke machine in a maroon sweater. So here's your homework. Rewatch the films, or if you're feeling dangerous, reread a few key chapters with this new Ron installed. Chamber of Secrets chessboard Ron. Prisoner of Azkaban. Say that again about Hermione Ron. Deathly Hallows locket hallucination Ron, who has to literally stab a physical manifestation of his worst thoughts about himself. Watch what happens when you treat him as a co-lead instead of the laugh track. You don't have to take my word for it. Pay attention to the background stuff the camera barely cares about. The way he steps between Harry and Sirius in the Shrieking Shack, still limping. The flicker on his face when Slughorn ignores him for Harry. The moment in Deathly Hallows Part 1 where he's silent at the radio, counting names of the dead like he's doing mental math on who he's already lost. The script doesn't shout it, but the performance is screaming, "This kid is not okay." Pattern interrupt. Next time you see a "Coward Ron" meme, I want you to imagine that same kid, ribs showing, trying to sacrifice himself on a stone horse while his two friends scream at him to stop. Does that meme still feel accurate? Or does it start to look like the movie version quietly gaslit you about who was brave and who was funny? When you do that rewatch, listen for the throwaway lines that suddenly hit like bricks. The self-deprecating jokes about being poor. The offhand comments about his brother's success. The way he talks about the Burrow like it's the center of the universe and also a place he can never quite live up to. Ask yourself, is this actually comic relief? Or is this a traumatized middle child weaponizing humor because that's the only magic he fully trusts? I want to hear what flips for you. Drop in the comments which Ron moment, big or tiny, suddenly felt different after this breakdown. Was it a look? A line? A silence? Did a scene you used to ignore suddenly feel like it belonged to him? Because this isn't just about Ron. This video is one piece of a bigger project where we're going to start stealing the narrative back for the whole cast the movie's Flattened. If the real Ron was hiding in plain sight, who else have we been watching on mute? So if you're still here, an hour and change into a Ron Weasley character autopsy, I have news for you. You're in the Ron Defense Squad now. You didn't just casually click on a video. You basically signed an unofficial contract in blood, or at least in watch time, to never again let Ron is useless fly past you unchallenged. You might be asking yourself, when did that happen? I was just listening to you yell about wizard chess. It happened slowly. We went from surface-level movie Ron, the walking eye roll and sandwich joke, to book Ron. The kid who literally wins a life-size death chess match in first year. Who knows the wizarding world inside out. Who spots patterns and social stuff Harry would never see. Then we dug into the messy parts. The jealousy. The insecurity. The locket bringing out the absolute worst in him. And we sat with the fact that he still came back. That's war survivor behavior, not comic relief. In case you've forgotten, we walked through him as the emotional pressure valve of the trio, the one who grounds Harry when he's spiraling and drags Hermione out of her own head, the one who actually represents what ordinary wizard even means in a story full of chosen ones and prodigies. We talked about the poor kid baggage, the hand-me-down wand, the fame envy that doesn't magically vanish just because he's funny. We watched him fail, leave, regret it, and choose to return knowing he might not be forgiven. That's not sidekick energy. That's protagonist tier growth. The film's quietly shoved into the background. So what do you do with all that? You don't have to take my word for it next time someone at a party goes, "Ron is just dead weight. Harry and Hermione carried him." You now have receipts. You can say, "Cool, but who sacrificed himself on the chessboard? Who figured out the basilisk had to be using the pipes? Who destroyed the Horcrux that literally weaponized his deepest fears?" You don't have to start a duel in the kitchen, but you can gently nudge people like, "Hey, maybe read the actual text before you drag the traumatized redhead." And if you're like me, you immediately thought of that one friend while I was talking. The one who still insists Hermione should have ended up with literally anyone else because Ron brings nothing to the table. Yeah, send this to them. Tag them. Drop it in the group chat. Frame it as a friendly challenge. Watch this, and then tell me with a straight face that Ron is useless. Worst case, you get a fun argument. Best case, you convert another member of the cult. If you want more of this kind of character rehab, this is the part where I ask you to actually feed the algorithm goblins. Drop a comment with your favorite Ron moment the movie's butchered, like the one line or scene you're still mad they cut. Hit like so. YouTube knows Ron is not, in fact, the weakest link. Subscribe if you want deep dives on other characters the film's flattened, because we're going to keep stealing the narrative back. 1. Wait. They were actually amazing. Breakdown at a time. 1. Wait. They were actually amazing. Breakdown at a time. So yeah, we've pretty much hit the bottom of the Ron Weasley iceberg. Or at least, the part anyone sane would still put on a YouTube channel, and not in a 400-page Ron-only manifesto your friends worry about. You might be asking yourself, is this really the bottom? Or is there some cursed trench full of even weirder Ron lore? And the answer is, of course there is. This is Harry Potter. There are always more fan theories, half-remembered JKR interviews, and that one person on Tumblr who's been cataloging Ron's every eyebrow twitch since 2004. But here's the thing I kind of love. When we drag all this darker, messier stuff into the light, the jealousy, the Horcrux locket whispering every insecurity he's ever had, the moment he literally walks out on Harry and Hermione, it doesn't ruin him. It makes him feel more like an actual person who could sit across from you at the Burrow's kitchen table, complaining about gnomes and quietly panicking about living up to his brothers. If you're like me, the more you see how badly Ron can screw up and still come back swinging, the more the whole story hits harder instead of feeling fragile. You don't have to take my word for it. Go back to the books and watch how many times he's the emotional barometer for the trio. How often Harry only realizes he's gone too far because Ron finally snaps. Or how Hermione's bravest moments land different when Ron is there backing her up instead of just cracking a joke in the corner. I mean, come on. The kid sacrifices himself in life-size wizard chess at 11, and then grows into the guy who comes back to a frozen lake, dives into nightmare water, and drags Harry and the Sword of Gryffindor out like some ginger anti-Excalibur moment. So now I want to hear from you. What's your favorite lost Ron moment the movie's either butchered or straight up stole? Is it his DA contributions, his whole anxious but actually competent Quidditch run, some throwaway line that made you go, oh, he's not stupid, he's traumatized and poor? Drop it in the comments. And while you're down there, tell me whose iceberg we're going to crack next. Ginny, secret main character. Weasley, Lupin with the world's saddest cardigan collection, Dumbledore and his morally questionable Grandmaster plan, or someone even wilder. If you want more right now, I've got you. Click over to the full Harry Potter Iceberg playlist where we zoom out from Ron and start pulling apart mandrakes, patronuses, and all the other magic that quietly stopped making sense when you hit puberty. Or jump straight to the Ginny breakdown if you want to watch the films commit character assassination in real time. And hey, thank you for not abandoning this video the way Ron abandoned the Horcrux hunt, and for coming back like he did. Because the next character we drag to the bottom of the iceberg, they might not make it back up.